Hello there, law-abiding listener. Are you looking for a new career full of excitement and intrigue, in search of high-paying, fast-paced jobs that will give you the freedom to control the freedom of others? Are you interested in stopping those nasty anarcho-syndicalists from destroying our precious capitalist paradise here in America? Well, friend, look no further than White City Investigations. At WCI, we value the skullbuster. We praise the kneecapper. We honor the union buster. And we want you to join our team. As a detective in the WCI, you'll be given new and unique opportunities to travel around this great country, jamming a stick in the spokes of those pesky workers' rights loonies. We need dedicated, intelligent, but not too intelligent, patriots to help quell the potential spread of unions whose mere existence spits in the face of progress, politics, and most importantly, profit. We also provide costumes. So, find your nearest WCI office to you and ask what you can do to help protect the almighty dollar and America from those dynamite-chucking anarchists. White City Investigations, getting America back to work, one case at a time. White City Investigations is a privately owned and operated company and is not in any way responsible for damages, injuries, or deaths caused to its employees while in the line of duty or even at home. White City Investigations cannot guarantee any form of employment stability or safety and retains the right to move any and all employees at any time for any reason.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
And today we're going to be discussing chapters, what we're calling chapters anyway, 4 through 6. They are unlabeled in the actual print edition, or pages 26 through 56 of Against the Day. Cody, you said you had a recap for us to kind of run through everything we read?
Yeah, we can call it that. It's a loose series of notes I took while reading through that kind of tie the general plot of these chapters together. We'll try to have something a little more comprehensive going forward, but this will do for now. We open with the Chums of Chance strolling around some skyships, who they then run into Merle Rideout and Chevrolet McAdoo. We get some really choice names to start the chapter. They are photographer and model, respectively. Miles spends some time bonding with Chevrolet over Hawaii and its music. Merle ostensibly is photographing skyships, and he's there with his daughter Dahlia, who he refers to as Dally. We find out that his wife, Erlis, ran away with Zombini the Mysterious, a magician. He offers to sell Dally to the Chums, and ends up taking kind of silly pictures of them and Chevrolet. Chick and Darby then use their lunch break to go down to the Midway Plaisance, but are interrupted by the presence of their kind of leader, de facto leader, Heino Vanderjuice. Turns out him and Merle are old friends. The Chums notice that the professor's acting a little unusual at lunch and kind of try to figure out what is going on with him. But the professor ends up leaving lunch in a hurry to go and meet up at the Palmer house with a character who we learn named Scarsdale Vibe. Vibe, who arrived in Chicago in disguise via what's called the Juggernaut, his private train, shows up with a cane gun. The professor Vanderjuice shows up literally hat in hand at a meeting with Vibe, who spends some time bragging about his wealth, and another character, Ray Ipso, who we will find out later a little more about him, challenges Vibe. There's a little back and forth between the two of them about the importance of money and its value in life. Ray ends up leaving and runs into Merle and Chevrolet in a place called the Pump Room. Merle and Ray there discuss how the professor, Heino Vanderjuice, seems a little more guarded about some of his ideas and seems to have a better understanding of the value of those ideas. Vibe is complaining to the professor that Nikola Tesla has a plan for this free electricity to provide that would kind of bring the world into a more modern era. And this has the effect of making Professor Vanderjuice feel like a failure, but Vibe wants to utilize him to sort of cancel out Tesla's plans, as he believes that free electricity would destroy the world. He wants Professor Vanderjuice to build a sort of jammer and work with Edison to bring Tesla down, allowing them basically unlimited funds from J.P. Morgan. Calls his lawyers to discuss the funding of that. Meanwhile, the Chums of Chance begin their surveillance runs. This is where we end up meeting Lou Bass Knight. They have a rather interesting discussion about whether the Chums are real and how real they might actually be. We find out that Lou has some horrible, unspeakable act that apparently occurred in his past that has kind of led him to where he is now. His coworkers and wife, before he was a detective, refused to tell him what happened, kind of leave him to navigate Chicago, where he ends up being taken in by what I kind of wrote down as a Tai Chi cult, who put him up in the Estonia Hotel until he can learn the procedure, as it's referred to. He ends up kind of going through their bizarre process and undertaking these strange lessons that kind of shape him into the person that he is when he joins up with the Chums after he's become a detective and goes through and starts working for White Seed Investigations. We spend about a year, I think, if I mathed it right, learning kind of Lou's backstory prior to where he meets up with the Chums. We get some interesting details about what led him to end up working with the WCI when he's recruited by Nate Prevett. He ends up being tasked as being a bodyguard for Archduke Ferdinand, which proves to be an exhausting and challenging assignment for him, as the Archduke really is just there to kind of act on whatever whim finds him at the time, whether it's hunting bison or ostensibly trying to find Hungarians that he can just hunt. Lou gets to know Max Nausch, which I'm probably butchering that name, who is also kind of tasked with keeping an eye on the Archduke. They end up at a place called the Boll Weevil Lounge, where the Archduke engages in a series of yo mama jokes and other offensive jokes with some of the bar patrons before finally promising to buy drinks for everybody in the bar and then essentially slipping out the back door so as to avoid any kind of actual fiduciary responsibility. Lou later gets tasked with infiltrating an anarchist group that's led by a preacher, Reverend Moss Gatlin, and attended by a rather diverse crowd of people, where he hears an anarchist hymn of sorts that really has an impact on him. And before he can really sort of start to understand the nature of everything that he's learning about these people, he finds out that he's being shipped off to Denver to work for the White Seed Investigation Office there. Lou struggles with breaking this news to the Chums of Chance as he's grown rather close to them. He begins to suspect that something's not right with the professor as well, and the professor ends up showing him. They kind of take a diversion on the inconvenience, where he is shown the what's become of the frontier, what's become of the American sort of frontier area outside of Chicago. Lou finally ends up exchanging gifts with the Chums of Chance. He gets a gold-plated membership pin, and he gives the Chums a spyglass that doubles as a emergency pistol of sorts, one-shot pistol. Whereupon this plunges the Chums into a sort of very dark period that we find out tends to occur in between their adventures, and we are left at the end witnessing the sort of deconstruction of the World's Fair and the impact that it has once all the glitz and glamour of that event is finally packed up and starts to move out of the city.
All right. Thank you, Cody. What were your all's general thoughts on this chunk of the book?
I love these chapters. there is an insane amount going on in these, 30 pages altogether?
Mhm.
Between learning more about the Chums and the sort of dark nature of what it is they do, being introduced to a couple of new characters in Merle and Professor Vanderjuice and Scarsdale Vibe, who are going to come into play in major ways throughout the rest of the story. There's a lot of discussion about the effect of capitalism on the sort of local area in which they exist, but also in a more macro sense. There's a couple of pages in the later part of these chapters that I think really encapsulates everything that this whole book is about. And we'll certainly talk about that more when we get there. But the idea of how great a force capitalism is and how damaging it has been since its sort of placement within America and the way that it has grown since then really plays such a huge part of how the story unfolds as it relates to the effect that it has on so many different groups of people, how it affects their lives, and how that radiates out from there even further. There's some great humor in this set of chapters, and I was so hard pressed to nail down a single quote for the end of this episode. I still don't know what it's going to be at this point. I'm just kind of going to wing it because there is an insane amount of just absolutely stunning writing that takes place in these 30 pages.
Yeah, true enough. I think I remarked to my fiance as we were sitting there, sort of just she was preparing dinner and I was reading across from her, and I just stopped once and I showed her like a page of notes from that section where they talk about whether or not the Chums of Chance are fictional, and it was like 2 pages worth of just like thoughts that I was writing out. And I was like, this is like one sentence.
Yeah, yeah.
and that sort of basically sums up kind of how this whole experience of reading has been for me so far, especially like coming to this book with no prior understanding of really not only what the content was, but even just what the narrative was. Like, I knew that the World's Fair had something to do with it, but that's already over 50 pages in. Past here, other than some like vague allusions that I've come across in researching the books we've already covered, I really still don't know what's going to happen. But it is impressive to me the pace with which ideas are sort of introduced and constructed, all within this kind of general concept of like dualities and sort of contrasting visions of America and the future and commerce and anarchism and all of that stuff, and how he is continuing to analyze that all within a city that at the time historically was very important to those concepts. Like, it makes perfect sense why he would set the beginning of the book here if these are going to be the ideas that he continues to examine over the rest of the runtime, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you're right. There are whole pages that I've highlighted from this section.
Yeah.
And like there's one part that I highlighted that I'm sure that I'll bring up as we continue on, where just like the margin note that I left next to the highlight was, yeah, I'm pretty sure you could probably easily sum up the entirety of Pynchon's writing just with these like 3 paragraphs. Like,
I'm
as
curious
far as
if it's the same section that I wrote out, almost identical note.
Yeah, is it the butcher, the frontier aspect in the butcher shop?
That's
Yeah,
exactly
it. Like, you could really deconstruct all of what Pynchon has been trying to write about for 60 years or whatever. With these couple of paragraphs. And I, the other thing that I come away with reading this section in particular is I'd love to know how this would flow after finishing Mason and Dixon. Like, if you had read Mason and Dixon then immediately picked this up, which would be, chronologically the next one you'd have to read.
Yeah.
From a year perspective. I feel like there's a lot of harmonious elements that I've been coming across with that book in particular, as I've kind of started to prep notes and get ready to continue doing this book.
There's some great, as you all already mentioned, there's some great prose sections in this section, some kind of astounding, wowing prose. I like Lou Bass Knight is one of my favorite characters in this book, if not my very favorite character.
Like, of all of Pynchon's characters?
No, just in this book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'd have trouble kind of picking a favorite character out of all of them, his whole canon. But a few different. I'll get into this as we go, page by page, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. But there's a few different. I do think that Pynchon is intentionally or subconsciously or both making some references or kind of showing some books that he's read in this section, which we'll get to. But I do think that there's some stuff that is very reminiscent of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair.
Yep.
I also think there's a bit of Kafka in the hotel description, especially what is it? Oh, America. Kafka's novel America. I don't think that influence is super pronounced, but I do think it's in there. The description of the hotel and the bellhop and all of that.
Yeah, the particular line of like, make sure you memorize the way there because it's unlikely that the bellhop is going to want to show you again. That's a very Kafkaesque line for sure.
Yeah, and I mean Kafka does a really good job of describing physical locations in a very dreamlike manner.
Mm-hmm.
And the hotel is definitely kind of has that kind of Kafka-esque, like kind of like it's like impossible to picture because you picture like this weird like endless labyrinth or something, which is kind of reminiscent of a few different concepts and physical locations and also kind of more like themes in Kafka's work.
Yeah, for sure.
And also the novel America does feature the main character is a bellhop in a hotel for a while.
Yeah, I don't have much new to say compared to what all of y'all have said because I feel very much the same way. It's these 3 chapters. I'm not sure I would go so far as to say that that specific section that Cody and Kate were mentioning contains all of Pynchon's books, but I would say that this is like peak Pynchon as his own symbol. When I think of Pynchonian things, it's hard to think of more extremely characteristic things than the anarchist hymn or Franz Ferdinand's cross-linguistic yo mama jokes or like just everything that is Lou Bosnight as a character at this point in time. Like so much of his sections, I would even say that like there's the motif, I guess, the device throughout the entire book of changing genres around settings and around characters. But Lou is an interesting one because it almost like more than any of the other specific characters, the style that is associated with him is like just Pynchon being Pynchon. Like the wackiest, zaniest parts of Gravity's Rainbow and The Crying of Lot 49 and Vineland and everything are all written in the same style as pretty much everything that happens to Lou throughout the book. And it's such a great character and such a great way of situating this device because he travels almost as much as the Chums of Chance do across the world as the book goes on, and he is also he changes a lot, but his style remains that characteristic postmodern American literature style.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a great introduction to that.
So chapter 4 begins, as Cody mentioned, with the group of the Chums of Chance just sort of strolling around amongst some of the other sky ships that are present at the fair. And eventually they are indeed approached by a photographer named Merle Rideout and his companion, subject, hard to say, Chevrolet McAdoo. And we learn that this pair is the same pair that ran out of the wilderness as the skyship was descending in the earlier chapters. And they wanted to sort of come and speak to them. We learn that probably Cody's understanding or Will's, I don't remember who said it, that they were shooting pornography, probably is correct. that is exactly what they were likely engaging in. They make some references in conversation to a couple of exotic dancers who performed at the 1893 at Little Egypt, and we get an idea of sort of some more details about who these two particularly are. In fact, there's some more like interesting references to religious stuff and sort of esoteric maybe references being made by the group. There's a reference here to Masuo Seitsen's wonderful Bacchanal as recently performed by the Paris Opera. I wanted to make a note of this because it is an opera about Samson and Delilah, which is another example of sort of these sort of biblical pairings like Adam and Eve as they were compared to in the previous chapters of that are sort of inherently tragic in one way or another. And this particularly prompted the story about Lilith and Eve in my mind from Vineland. This idea that like when two women are together in this sort of like paradisical, milieu, everything's fine. But as soon as this sort of man asserts himself in, suddenly one of them is exploited. And there is a possible reading of these two characters that she is being exploited in some way, either for the pornography that they're shooting, for the life that she's been put in because of sort of the milieu they move through, or because we've learned very shortly after this that Merle himself is like a pretty shitty person and who's just like down to sell his own child to a prospective bidder. So just again, like interesting stuff between the two of them thematically that may tie into other things that Pynchon has talked about. Then we get a brief aside on Hawaiian culture and music. Cody, you assert that this is probably Pynchon's admiration of Hawaiian music coming through?
As much as we get between Vineland and here and in pretty much all of his other works, I think he's a fan of, if not Hawaiian music in general, I think it's safe to say he's a big ukulele fan. I don't think you plug that instrument in particular into so much of your work without having an affinity for it in some capacity.
Yeah, probably. A performance they're going to be doing at the actual White City. Merle then starts taking some photos of the flying machines, and then we get a couple of different descriptions shortly thereafter of different machinery that's present. On page 27, we read, "The smoke from breakfast campfires rose fragrantly through the air. Babies could be heard in both complaint and celebration. Far-off sounds of railway traffic and lake navigation came in on the wind. Against the sun, as yet low across the lake, wings cast long shadows, their edges luminous with dew. There were steamers, electrics, Maxim whirling machines, ships powered by gun-cotton reciprocators and naphtha engines, and electrical lifting screws of strange hyperboloidal design for drilling upward through the air, and winged aerostats of streamlined shape and wing-flapping miracles of ornithurgy. The fellow scarcely knew after a while where to look." Before we kind of move on from this, one of the things that's mentioned there, the Maxim whirling machine, is a real invention. The Maxim whirling machine in particular was basically an early version of a wind tunnel that would have been used to test aircraft. However, the more interesting thing about this to me is that it was also created by Hiram Stevens Maxim, who was in no way but completely responsible for inventing the machine gun. He created something called the Maxim gun, which was used by the British Army to subjugate and put down cultural revolutions all over the world. This weapon was often referred to as the weapon most associated with imperial conquest and was heavily used by colonial powers during the scramble for Africa during the age of new imperialism between 1883 and 1914. So realistically, the name Maxim to a lot of people at the time would have been more associated with this weapon that he created. Looking at it, it kind of looks like one of the first sort of belt-fed, like what we would call light machine guns now. It's sort of pushed around on wheels, unlike the machine guns that were used by some of the forces in like the American West. There's no crank associated with it, so you don't have to have some guy sitting there like holding a crank around. It could just run. So the interesting thing to me, and the reason why I wanted to make sure that this was mentioned, is Pynchon seems to be showing the danger and inherent evil of commerce here. In the imperial core, those inventors, who are often the same ones that create these machines of death, are creating these amazing sort of leaps forward in technology. And like, look how we can now test to see if planes are aerodynamic or if flying machines are aerodynamic with this big whirly thing that I have. But in actuality, this man made his name off of, creating a weapon of mass destruction and death that allowed people to be put into bondage and slavery across the mid east, across Africa, across some of the South American countries. And then if you sort of continue to go on just a little bit, there's a mention of the idea, or sorry, go back just a little bit. There's a mention of this idea of the white city and sort of the black city around it. If you go back to kind of when the two chums of chance are headed into the actual fair to see everything, and you see how there's this kind of perfect white stucco representation of the modern world, of commerce, of the powers that we now have through technology and electricity, and then everything that is subjugated by that outside of the imperial core is stuck and relegated to the outside. And you see the difference inherent in that, this group of people on the outside is going to be more familiar with the name Maxim from the guns that were pointed at them, but that group of people from the inside are going to be familiar with it because it allows them to create, better flying craft or better machines in general. So again, like speaking to these ideas of duality that we talked about all through last episode and now into this next section, this is another example of that. How Pynchon is describing the fact that like there is no, at least that we are seen capable of as humans, good commerce that we're capable of, and that these things that can be used for good are oftentimes just part of a portfolio of products, so to speak, that are just as well used for evil. And that this is something that will continue to be brought up over this section, and I imagine the rest of the book. You've got another sort of invention that's mentioned here, Cody, but before that, do we have any thoughts on Merle trying to sell a child? Because she shows up before going back to the different sort of inventions that are described.
It's not great. It's
he also plies her with liquor, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's drunk when she shows up.
Yeah, he mentions that he's out of liquor to give her, so yeah.
So I'm sorry, I'm gonna push back very hard. I don't think he's giving Dahlia liquor. I think this is kind of in the spirit of how I've decided in the past, or I've come to the conclusion in deep dive interpretations of specific sections of Pynchon's books. This is Merle trolling the Chums of Chance like Pynchon does the reader.
Oh,
because
I can see that.
Because say, Pa, I need a drink is obviously going to inspire, especially in this time period where I think, and this is just pulled out of my ass number, but I did hear it at some point, something like 45 gallons of liquor per year was the average consumption rate in America.
Jesus.
So
yeah, the 1800s were like insane with the alcohol consumption.
Yeah, so in which case, Dahlia coming up and saying, "Dad, I'm thirsty," him just saying, "Oh well, we're all out of corn liquor. You're gonna have to make do with old cow juice," is just a dad joke of sorts. And when he makes that joke and Lindsay responds the way Lindsay does, and then when he mentions Erlis running away with Zombini the Magnificent, or the Mysterious, sorry, what I see that is as him saying, "Oh, these are great marks for my pranks," and then proceeding to just lean in so hard to being edgy for the sake of being edgy, because I don't think Merle's a bad guy. If I might be misremembering the rest
No,
of the
he's
book.
not. That's where I'm kind of conflicted, and I think I might agree with you in a sense that he might just be trying to see how far he can push a joke, and that's where the trying to sell his daughter. I don't think he genuinely would have done it. I think you could read it in a sense of like he's just doing it to see like how far can I carry this and how much how far are they going to go with it. At the same time, though, it is that kind of shit did happen at that time, so
absolutely,
it's a weird balancing act that's going on there.
Yeah, the reason. So what informs that interpretation for me is that, as we see later on with the conversations with Professor Vanderjuice, he's a tinker in like both the traditional sense and in the modern sense of like, oh, they're an inventor. Mm-hmm. He goes around taking photos and selling the photographs, as we find out later in the book. But also he just likes understanding science, and that's why he became a photographer. So for him, knowing how to hawk knowing how to take advantage of an opportunity. He knows all of that. That's all fluent language for him. So for him to just substitute in the normal pitching tactics of like, oh, take portraits. If you take 3, I'll knock the price down to this much. I could totally see him just essentially on the fly improvising these jokes about selling Dahlia because of how naive these chums of chance seem to be to him.
Do you think it's more like when I was a kid and my dad would threaten to sell me to a roving band of gypsies if I didn't knock my behavior off?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And this is something we talked about last week, or at least I talked about it. I think we kind of generally discussed it, is how a lot of the characters in this book are, they can be both likable and evil, or there's a mixture of good and evil in pretty much every character. And I do think I remember from reading the rest of this book that, Merle is likable, but he's not a perfect person. I think he's kind of more depicted as kind of sad later on in the book. But I do think that that's an aspect of it where, I like Merle, but I also think that he could. I mean, I don't want to push back too much because I do think that is an element that could be an element of his character in this section is he's joking, but I also think he could not be joking, or he could be seeing how they react to what he could play off as a joke, if that makes sense. I think he's a good example of the mixture of good and evil of pretty much every character in this book.
Yeah, I think that regardless of however you want to characterize Merle, the commentary on taking literal children and selling them for a profit is valid. That's all there.
Yeah.
It's just that when his little pitch is punctuated with things like Merle went on twinkling directly at Lindsay Noseworth, strangling with indignation, and the way it slowly escalates up, and the fact that he's delivering this pitch to like people who are around 18 at the oldest. I don't see it as likely that he thinks that they're gonna purchase his daughter. So I personally don't see it as a very likely thing for him to actually be trying to sell her.
Yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying. At any rate, after this interaction, Merle wants to take a photo of them in front of a Trouvé screw. Cody, do you have some notes you took on this guy?
Yeah, there's a lot about this guy I was completely unaware of. So his name is Gustave Trouvé, and he was quite the inventor. Among the things he invented, and there is a whole list of the things that he invented on Wikipedia, and it's insane. Most notably, he created a device to locate iron or lead bullets in people using electric conduction. It would actually give off a signal when it was finding. It's sort of like a small metal detector. A lot of what he did was essentially miniaturized versions of things that had already existed. He made a portable telegraph with a 1 kilometer range in 1872. He improved the sound of Alexander Graham Bell's phone in 1878 by adding a second layer of membrane to it to increase the volume and the distance that the sound could travel at a high quality. He invented the prototype for the modern endoscope in 1878. He fitted a rechargeable battery to the motor of a tricycle to create the first electric vehicle in 1880. He created the marine outboard motor in 1881. And I thought this was the most interesting that it's in a Pynchon book. He made 2 mechanical birds, one in 1870 and a second more advanced version in 1891 that were both capable of flying.
Wow. Pynchon does seem to have done his homework when it comes to inventors of the pre-modern era.
Yeah. And all before the internet was a really big and available commodity to him. So this is just hours of research in books at the library, most likely.
Yeah. It's very impressive. But I also get the sense that maybe Pynchon feels like this era of history was the last opportunity that we had to get things right.
That's exactly what I'm thinking too.
And so he probably already kind of was mildly obsessed with it, I'd imagine, long before he started writing the book. But also, if the history, as it's understood, when Pynchon said that he was writing 3 books at once at one point, it's very likely that this could have been one of those books that he was already working on back in. Like, when was that? Like the 70s or like
mid to late 70s, I think, right after
when he
Gravity's
said
Rainbow was
that,
published.
yeah. So it's possible that all of that research he did extends all the way back to that time frame in the library.
Yeah.
The photograph that is taken has a pretty funny description. Does someone want to read that paragraph starting on 28? The boys fascinated as always.
The boys, fascinated as always with modern sciences such as the photographic, were of course happy to comply. Chevrolet managed to mollify even Lindsay by borrowing his skimmer and holding it coyly in front of their faces, as if to conceal a furtive kiss, while the frolicsome Darby Suckling, without whose spirited clowning no group snapshot would have been complete, threatened the pair with a baseball bat and a comical expression meant to convey his ingenuous notion of jealous rage.
If you ever forget that maybe these people are children, their reaction to having a photograph taken of them, and then also when they're granted leave shortly after that, when they immediately decide to go see what is effectively a burlesque show.
Yeah.
That when Chevrolet says that she can show them backstage, one of them goes, oh boy, and his nose begins to run.
Yeah. Goes beyond just giddy excitement.
Yeah. It's pretty funny. And then of course we get someone else yelling suckling, perhaps in a Calvin and the Chipmunks sort of Ren and Stimpy way, which I there's no way to know if it's intentional, but I wouldn't put it past him.
Yeah.
Not even close. Then as some ships arrive and take off, we are introduced to Professor Heino Vanderjuice of Yale University.
Names. A bounty of wonderful names. I love it.
I mean, Pynchon's names are always like a big deal in his books, but it feels like he had an extra amount of fun writing the names for this particular book.
Zombini the Mysterious, Heino Vanderjuice. Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, it's great. He's a Yale University professor who's had some past experiences with the Chums of Chance, and his description here on page 29 I love, where it says, the boy's longtime friend and mentor, Professor Heino Vanderjuice of Yale University, a look of barely suppressed terror on his features, desperately preoccupied during the craft's descent with keeping secure to his head a stovepipe hat whose dense scars and departures from the cylindrical spoke as eloquently as the outdated style of a long and adventuresome history. That's just such a great sort of depiction of a character where just as soon as he shows up, you kind of know exactly sort of who he is.
Mm-hmm.
Based on that, just like little description of the hat that he's wearing, and the fact that he like can't let go. If he loses this hat through a sketchy descent, he's going to be less of a person to himself.
I also love his manner of speaking is so of that time, but so much fun too. That like galloping gas bags, but it's just capital to see you fellas again.
Last I heard, you'd come to grief down in New Orleans, no doubt from packing away more alligator étouffée than that old Indian's quite had the lift for. He like I could see this being played by Conan O'Brien.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So, and by the way, if you have not had alligator, I'd recommend it. It's very tasty. Good meat, that alligator, étouffée especially. At any rate, we're then given some idea of some recent marvels that were emerging from Sloan Laboratory. All of this has sort of standing in real history, which we've got some notes on too. If you want to run through those, Cody.
Yes, Sloan Laboratory is Yale's physics lab, and the people that are named in here have some pretty significant impact in the areas of mathematics and electronic engineering. Josiah Gibbs was a Latin and mathematics professor, I believe, at Yale. He worked a lot with vector analysis and quaternions, which are going to both come into huge factors later in this book. Lee DeForest was referred to as the father of radio. He was an early electronics engineer and pioneer and an inventor. And then Kimura, who's not given a first name in here, I took some digging to find his name. Shunkichi Kimura was a mathematics major from Yale. He published a paper called On the Nabla of Quaternions and other papers that dealt with wireless telegraphy. So these are some big names in turn of the century mathematics and electronics that it's very evident that they're here for a reason, and they would have a lot of impact on the things that were going on around this time that lay a lot of the foundation for what takes place in this book and is taking place in world history at this time.
Yeah, we also get a reference to a character named Re Ipso, which his name in Latin means the thing itself. This was a sort of motto by people who believed in the philosophy of phenomenology, which from Wikipedia, phenomenology proceeds systematically, but it does not attempt to study consciousness from the perspective of clinical psychology or neurology. Instead, it seeks to determine the essential properties and structures of experience. Phenomenology is not a matter of individual introspection. Subjective account of experience, which is the topic of psychology, must be distinguished from an account of subjective experience, which is the topic of phenomenology. Its topic is not mental states, but worldly things considered in a certain way. Phenomenology is a direct reaction to the psychologism and physicalism of founder Edmund Husserl's time. It takes as its point of departure the question of how objectivity is possible at all. The experience of the world and its subjects is thoroughly subjective. So far from being a form of subjectivism, phenomenologists argue that the scientific ideal of a purely objective third person is a fantasy and falsity. The perspective and presuppositions of the scientist must be articulated and taken into account in the design of the experiment and the interpretation of the results. Inasmuch as phenomenology is able to accomplish this, it can help to improve the quality of empirical scientific research. Stated more simply, phenomenology is a philosophy that takes into account the idea that we do not have the capacity for objective experiential thought. That, like, every time we remember something, we remember it differently. When we read something in a newspaper, to quote later in this section of chapters, our opinion of it can change. Things like that it tries to take into an account, which helps to improve the quality of, like it says in there, scientific research. Near as I can tell, that's going to be a really big deal in this book, especially as it already has started to grapple with whether or not the Chums of Chance are fictional characters, whether or not, things that happen to something like someone like Lou Bass-Knight actually happened, or if it was something else entirely, or why he can't remember it. Already sort of 50 pages into the book, this concept of, like, what is objective reality, what is constructed reality is a huge deal. There's a line later in these chapters that refers to the fictional white city and the non-fictional sort of city of Chicago surrounding it, and how those things play out as we understand them in the real world. So it makes perfect sense why there would be someone with this name in the book.
I also think there's an aspect of, like, a big part of this book, or not. I mean, a major theme of this book, I would say at least, is the interplay between commerce and science, which I do think is an aspect of the name and all the stuff you were just talking about.
You're absolutely correct, especially with how those things get co-opted by one another too. Like, going back to the Maxim gun guy, this is somebody who is at his core like a scientist and an inventor. Or the fact that, the guy who invented dynamite was killed by dynamite, and that dynamite was then used to, create bombs, and then eventually sort of like the nuclear bomb. So certainly I would say you're right on the money there, Luke.
Yeah, and then I had a footnote, I guess, to the Re Ipso thing, the phenomenology in general. If folks will remember my name dropping of the German idealist philosophers in the previous section, in the previous episode of our podcast, there's kind of a sharp dividing line between those German idealists who are still to this day heavily cited and viewed as foundational figures of contemporary philosophy to the 21st century, and then the existentialists who are broadly characterized, people like Sartre. Existentialism can be traced as far back as the Soren Kierkegaard, but Husserl is kind of important in the German timeline of philosophy, because he is the direct precursor to Martin Heidegger, who is viewed as not direct precursor as in his beliefs led directly to Heidegger's beliefs, but his discussion of phenomenology was highly influential on early existentialism. And Heidegger, one of those early existentialists, was kind of the mascot for the Nazi Party's philosophical side of things. So there's this sharp divide where prior to the 19th century, you have, people coming together with Kant saying, here are the limits of pure reasoning. And by the beginning of the 20th century, you have people like Martin Heidegger saying, Yes, but we still can use pure logic to justify why it's good to commit the Holocaust. And Husserl is kind of that midpoint in the evolution of ideas.
Excellent additional context there too. If all of this wasn't enough information to jam into, let's see, 3 paragraphs, we also get a reference to another sort of adventure that the Chumps of Chance went on, where he says, "Just missed you boys once, over there in that cartoon business," the genial Skyfarer informed them. "Trying to make it out of town, a couple steps ahead of the Mahdi's army. Saw you sailing overhead, wish I could have been on board. Had to settle for jumping in the river and wait until the clam bake subsided a little." This is another reference to an ugly portion of history of the time that the Chumps of Chance just happened to be sort of around. For those who are not sure what this is referring to, this has to do with the revolution in Egypt-controlled Sudan, when a man claimed he was the Mahdi. In Islam, the Mahdi is sort of their concept of the prophesied Messiah, and he led a campaign against the Egyptians controlling their state. So why include this, especially with the details of the other stuff that we've read so far? To me, I think it's another example of duality, and sort of this idea that he's already working with of karmic balance. He mentions it here, and then with the stuff with Lou Bass-Knight, there's also sort of a reference again of karmic balance or karmic debt having been incurred that one has to pay off, which of course echoes Wind Dust and all of the stuff that's talked about in Bleeding Edge. The Mahdis beat back their oppressors, so yay, good thing, only to then oppress the Coptic Christians that had a high percentage of population in Sudan at the time, forcing them to convert to Islam. Also, declaring anyone not accepting Muhammad Ahmad al-Mahdi as the awaited Mahdi to be infidels who should be killed and have their property seized. Eventually, in 1909, so after the sort of time period of this book is over, the British had completed a campaign to wipe out the Mahdi and his surviving army. It was mostly accomplished in a pretty short period of time, but they didn't completely sort of root out the entirety of the Mahdi's army in Darfur until 1909. And then they made Sudan a colony. Technically, it was a power-sharing situation with Egypt again, but it essentially was everything except on paper, another colony of the British Empire. And you end up in this situation again, where like a chamber of commerce existing in Tibet, there's still evil in government, even when it's one that sort of led a successful revolution that shook off its oppressors. The karmic wheel eventually just comes back around, and just by a eviler force, you have the Mahdi shaking off one oppressor, then oppressing another group of people, and then evil just adds to evil, and the British come back in and reset them to zero, but in a worse situation. And this again gets back to Pynchon's sort of idea of these karmic cycles, or this sort of great balance board that he talks about at the end of Vineland, of one person constantly pushing down the scale, and you end up with this, I guess probably most importantly, I should say, you end up with this understanding that the entire reason that the Mahdi needed to oppress the Coptic Christians was to rebuild the economy of Sudan. Like that was, the war had cost a lot. The war had destroyed a lot of the burgeoning sort of industry that existed in Sudan. And to rebuild that, he needed money, he needed property, he needed land. And the only way that he was going to be able to get that was through this decree that people who didn't accept him as the Mahdi would need to have their assets seized. So it all goes back to, again, this idea that Pynchon is working with of kind of the almighty dollar, or the almighty commerce, or the way that history is supposed to go in order to sort of quote Scarsdale vibe in the next scene over. But again, just another one of these examples that we point out all the time of like, here's sort of a throwaway line that has a lot of deep history and meaning and backstory to it that leads further back into the kind of the themes that the book is talking about. And it is another sort of piece to add in about what the Chums of Chance might be involved with, and who the forces are that might be controlling them. They are constantly showing up around stuff that is going wrong, or is violent, or is sort of revolutionary behavior in one way or another. From there, we figure out that the professor and Merle Rideout know each other. Merle says that he's still up to no good, which again can be taken literally or as a joke, especially in context of the previous scenes. we then learn that the two of them work together in Connecticut, and they take a photo together, and then they decided to leave off to go to a nearby steakhouse to lunch. And then from there, he leaves along with Ray Ipso to head out to the Palmer House. Palmer House is a real Chicago hotel. It's one of two really big historical hotels in Chicago that are right next to each other. You can still go stay there, although it's owned by the Hilton now, so it's not going to look like it did back then. But it's important from a perspective of showing kind of the environs they're working with. This was a very famous, wealthy hotel that famous, wealthy people would go and stay in. And from there, we get a very interesting aside. Does someone want to read the quote on page 30? It swiftly became evident to Ray Ipso to the end of that paragraph.
I've got it here. It swiftly became evident to Ray Ipso that his friend was in town to conclude a bargain with forces that might be described, with little risk of overstatement, as evil. In the suite upstairs, they found heavy curtains drawn against the festive town, lamps sparsely distributed in a perpetual twilight of tobacco smoke, no cut flowers or potted plants, a silence punctuated only rarely by speech, and that generally telephonic.
I love that description of the room because it is literally a smoke-filled back room that they're entering into, which should give you an idea of who it is that you're going to be introduced to. And that is a man named Scarsdale 5, who has showed up to not only go to the world's Columbian Expedition, but to sort of exploit its thousands of commercial possibilities. And he's also there to conduct a bunch of his own business. He rode into town on a private train. That should also tell you the kind of level of wealth you're dealing with when this guy shows up. He has his own train. His train is called the Juggernaut, and the Against the Day wiki from the Pinch on Wiki summarized a lot of this stuff really well. The idea of what this private train may be referring to is that the name derives from the Sanskrit. I'm not going to mess up the pronunciation of that word, but in Sanskrit, the word would mean Lord of the Universe, which happens to be one of the many names of the Lord Krishna. Krishna itself means black or dark-skinned. British colonial urban legend had it that Hindus sought to be crushed under the wheels of giant cars in Krishna's chariot procession at Puri as a way of gaining salvation. And then there is a long quote about how capitalism itself may be best described as a juggernaut, and as something that, as a result of its defining of space, literally disembeds you from time and space, is what he says. In this quote, it says, in pre-modern societies, space was in the area in which one moved. Time was the experience one had while moving. In modern societies, however, the social space is no longer confined by the boundaries set by the space in which one moves. One can now imagine what other spaces look like, even if he's never been there. And I think that most commonly harkens back to Against the Day, or I'm sorry, to Mason and Dixon, rather, where they're drawing the line and the effect that has, particularly on the first farmer they come across, who suddenly realizes that he can buy more land on the other side of that line that they're drawing, and how suddenly there are these other spaces that he didn't, before now, understand were different from his own. So certainly, once again, the same kind of stuff that Pynchon has talked about in a lot of his books is finding a lot of harmony, I think, in this book in particular. That sociologist is named Anthony Giddens, that the Pynchon Wiki summarizes. So from there, as Cody described in the beginning, he's dressed very specifically, very well appointed, has a cane gun, and is just sort of a brutalist figure, I guess, is the best way that I could describe him. The way that he moves, the way that he just sort of asserts himself in the spaces that he walks through.
Casually shoots a woman in the leg.
Yeah, just, and isn't worried about whether or not there are any kind of, consequences for that may be forthcoming.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's sort of the caricature of who Donald Trump thinks he is.
He's a Mr. Burns-esque, over the top villain, but he's actually he's establishing himself as a credible threat.
Yeah. His entrance in this book, especially with him shooting that woman in the lobby, really is one of those moments where I'm like, man, I would love to see what this looks like filmed in some way.
Oh my god, yes.
Just him rolling off of the train and swaggering into a hotel and then just shooting one of the first people he sees. And then I just love the way it ends, where it says, "Tell the house physician the bullet is only in her leg," said Scarsdale Vibe helpfully.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I have a bit of a deep read of that paragraph, actually.
Oh, cool.
okay.
First of all, I just want to say, because this is an issue, anytime you talk about anything Hindu, the Pynchon Wiki page for Jagannatha, or the discussion of Jagannatha, is way oversimplifying it. It is way more convoluted than that. Hinduism is not one thing, and Jagannatha is not one thing either. Jagannatha is various different things, but it is the two big things are a deification of sorts of the temple chariots that people would take around to celebrate specific deities on various holy days. The symbolism of Jagannatha is deeply. I mentioned the insufficiency of categorizing anything Hindu, because we're talking about thousands of years of discourse that are trying to be distilled into like single words. And Jagannatha is really, really deeply entwined with discussion of time and the unendingness of time. And so those temple chariots in some interpretations of Jagannatha are viewed as literally just symbolic of the onward march of time, and the discussion of it on Wikipedia of Jagannatha is a lot of how it's symbolized with steamrollers and rhinoceroses and elephants, because of that sense of just forward march of things. And so you have Scarsdale Vibe, whose name I don't know anything about it specifically, but the Pynchon Wiki talks about it as literally just being like the vibe of a wealthy upstate New York town.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this man named that rolling into town on the Juggernaut, a line holding a cane with the globe inscribed on it, and that cane also contains a lethal weapon. So who else in Pynchon's writings are associated with the globe, period? You have, in terms of books that we've covered, you have Neville Maskelyne as the person who figured out a way to discern where on the globe you are in a latitudinal sense from a naval perspective, and went on to be one of the major people in the foundations of cartography going forward. You have the Gabriel Ice character talking about the global future being one held and navigated by supercomputers in the Arctic, with the lines of control extending via the internet down throughout the rest of the world. And then you have the fourth part of Gravity's Rainbow, the tarot reading of Blissero, being the world. So here you have this symbol of progress, the railroad, bringing the juggernaut on a straight line into Chicago at the World's Fair, being held by a guy whose name is literally Vibe, who uses lethal force against kind of the most sympathetic possible figure, a respectably but not sumptuously dressed older woman saying that I would abandon you if you were my own child. And instead of killing her, he shoots her in the leg and thinks, oh yes, all I've done here is get her out of my way. All of those things, I think, are incredibly thematically prescient for all of Pynchon's works, but they are all put nicely into that paragraph right there.
Sounds excellent to me. Yeah, I have nothing else that I could possibly add to that. The crossover with the globe in particular, I had not taken note of.
Well, and you can go further, even if you want to dig into that one. It's if he is holding the globe and Blikero's future is the world, this small air-propelled bullet, what does it become?
Sorry, I couldn't tell. Was that a rhetorical question?
It was meant to be a rhetorical question. If you want to respond, I'm sure some of our listeners
trying to
appreciate it.
formulate a response, but I was like, I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's the threat of of death looming overhead via the V2 rocket, right? It's the nuclear threat that demotivates everyone in Vineland in the later books.
Yeah.
And it's all being held by Scarsdale Vibe, who thinks he's being helpful by saying, "Oh, I just shot her in the leg."
Which, I mean, that also does, of course, link back to sort of Mason's vision at the warrior path that leads to the atomic bomb as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great stuff. So we learn that Scarsdale Vibe is there to meet Ray Ipso, as well as Professor Vanderjuice. We get an idea that well, first of all, there's some ridiculous commentary on just how rich these people are. The quote, "I know this fellow back in New Jersey," said Scarsdale Vibe, "collects railroads, not just rolling stock mine, but stations, shed, rails, yards, personnel, the whole shebang. Expensive hobby," marveled the professor. "Are there such people? You have to have some idea of the idle money out there. It can't all be down payments or endowments to the church or of one's choice. Mansions and yachts and dog runs paved with gold or what have you. Can it? No. At some point, that's all over with. It all has to be left behind. And still there's this huge mountain of wealth unspent piling up higher every day. And dear, oh dear, whatever's a businessman to do with it, you see." This is an interesting comment because that is a problem that has only grown in size and scope now than it was certainly at the time this book is representing, but also when the book was published. The quantity of wealth someone can amass now is so big that it is impossible to get rid of. Famously, when Mackenzie Scott and Jeff Bezos divorced, Mackenzie Scott obviously got half of his money, and as a result of that, she has spent the past however many years it's been trying to give that away. But the interest that gets accrued on the value of the Amazon stock and on all of the other assets that she was given has made it impossible for her to actually do that. So like what Scarsdale Vibe is describing here is actually very real. Like you can do all sorts of charitable giving, you can do all sorts of endowment, but at the end of the day, the money will just keep stacking up, even if in some cases you're not doing anything. Because Mackenzie Scott isn't writing books and isn't going on tours anywhere and isn't, trying to generate more income. It's just generating off of the back of income in this sort of strange Ouroboros that is like strangling the world, essentially. And, especially in the modern era, you have these billionaires that are so rich and bored that they're going to space now just for fun. Because what else are you going to do with your time when you don't have anything to do with your time, really? It is a very sort of prescient line for the times that we're living in now. That obviously still would have held meaning back then, but certainly has only continued to. We get this kind of then back and forth where it says, "Hell, send it on to me," Ray Ipso put in, "or even to somebody who really needs it. For sure, there's enough of those." "That's not the way it works," said Scarsdale Vibe. So we always hear the plutocracy complaining. Out of a belief surely fathomable that merely to need a sum is not to deserve it. Except that in these times, need arises directly from criminal acts of the rich, so it deserves whatever amount of money will atone for it. Fathomable enough for you? And then is certainly possible of being read as a sort of shortly contained interpretation of James chapter 5. The book of James is one of the later sort of epistical works of the New Testament that is written by someone that a lot of people consider to be Jesus' half-brother. Technically, if you go back through the etymology of the name James and the early manuscripts that exist of that particular book of the New Testament, it's more likely that the anglicized version of the name would be Jacob, and then you end up kind of with this idea that it may be Jesus' half-brother, but it is a letter to the 12 tribes of Israel, particularly the ones concentrated in Jerusalem. For historical context, James, or Jacob, was the sort of leader of a church that, in theory, from a historical perspective, may have been established by Jesus and was trying to preach conversion to the kind of Jewish upper class that was existing in the capital of Israel, and was eventually killed for it. And in chapter 5 of this letter, as he's trying to kind of preach his message, not just about Jesus, but also about repentance and also about the importance of accepting the gospel and sort of all of that, There's this section of 6 verses that is very relevant to what it is that was just stated against today. Where I'll just read this. This comes from the New American Standard Bible. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. So again, getting back to this concept of what is going to convict the rich man in the eyes of God is the existence of his wealth, and that these things corrode and pass away, and they just get piled up and hoarded in somebody's last days. And at the end of it all, it was earned off of the backs of slaughter and of harming the people that they were employing, ostensibly. And so it is a very accurate sort of sentiment to say that it's a summation of those 6 verses. Attempt at providing a rhetorical balm to the people that are under the yoke of the rich. It goes on to say, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters. You will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. And it goes on and on from there, basically encouraging them to wait until the Lord's return would be the context of that. But in the case of this book, certainly this is the kind of rhetoric that would be used by the labor unions or the anarchists, as they're put, speaking out like, yeah, you just got to be patient until we get enough people together. You got to be patient until we get a big enough workforce sort of banded together that we can fight back against the plutocrats who are continuing to hoard this wealth, amass this wealth. So that's some additional context to kind of where this conversation is coming from. And there's another reference in here to the idea of suffering fools, particularly after they go back and forth about whether or not Ray Epso is a socialist. There's a line here that says, Fibe chuckled soothingly, the professor's afraid you're going to chase me off with radical talk like that. But I am not that sensitive a soul. I am guided as ever by 2 Corinthians. He had a careful look around the table, estimating the level of scriptural awareness. 2 Corinthians 11:19 in particular, where he then goes on to say, suffering fools is unavoidable, said Ray Ipso, but don't ask me to be glad about it. So again, some very specific usage of the Bible in these contexts, which gets back to some of the other stuff that Pynchon has written about, and that is certainly accurate to history, and that the Bible was used to justify slave labor. The Bible was used to justify all sorts of cruel acts in the name of commerce or of capitalism or of modernity. The Bible can be used for whatever you want. I had a professor once when I was in seminary who told me that if you wanted to create a cult centered around a doctrine of slaughtering frogs, you'd be able to find biblical lines specifically to kind of build that thought process out. And you can kind of see them jockeying over that here in these sections of the page.
And not to mention, too, that he uses a common kind of retort for wealthy people when confronted about the vastness of their wealth is, to call someone a socialist for wanting to, God forbid, share the wealth with, people who might actually need it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and the deep irony of all of this, at least from my perspective, is that, Kate, you referred to the book of James, and in today's, at least in North American Protestant churches, the book of James is most frequently going to be referred to as the basis for a lot of prosperity gospel teachings.
Yep, absolutely true.
But yeah, just flipping all that on its head.
It's funny how those things work when enough time is dedicated to looking at them. From there, we get some references to everyone's favorite inventor, Tesla. Or should I say David Bowie?
That's all I see.
We discover sort of what the beginning of this whole sort of meeting was supposed to be about. It has to do with this idea that Tesla's trying to create free electricity for everyone, which is a real thing. Tesla wanted his sort of ideal kind of invention that he continually worked towards was sort of a international or global, rather, for lack of a better term, network of electricity that anyone could just sort of tap into. He was working on early like wireless technology for his usages of electricity, and especially lighting. A lot of his early inventions that people would like come and sort of see his laboratory or inventors village for had these systems of interconnected lights that could be used to create street lamps later on, and all sorts of things. So this is a very real thing that he was working on in actual history. It is also true that he did work with Edison at first, but they clashed on the difference between alternating current and direct current, and so the two of them kind of went their separate ways to work on those opposing viewpoints on electricity and what the best current would be going forward. And then both of them actually did produce showcases for the World's Fair this year that the book is covering. And obviously from a purely capitalist kind of evil perspective, in the same way that free internet would be a problem, free electricity would also be a problem. And so Scarsdale is hoping that he can have somebody paid well enough to learn how this machine that Tesla's working on could be built, how it could be sabotaged, and then to potentially do that sabotage for him, so that the chances of this particular invention being completed and then actually sort of disseminated is slim to none. But the capitalist class, the capital holding class, can continue on making as much money as they had for quite some time at this point. It's also revealed that his funding is coming partially through someone who's referred to as Pierpoint. That individual is J.P. Morgan, in case you're unfamiliar with what the P in J.P. stands for. and so you have this kind of alliance between some of the early sort of capital class members of this society, especially from the Gilded Age, working together with this fictional one to sort of put down this possible invention. That's kind of the summation of what they're talking about here. Does anyone have any detail they want to fill in about this conversation or this scene?
I just want to read a couple of sections from it that I think really kind of epitomize what Vibe's whole vibe is, and just the kind of general view of these people, of these hyper capitalists and plutocrats. On page 33, he is naive enough to think that he can get financing for this from Pierpont or me or one or two others. It has escaped his mighty intellect that no one can make any money off an invention like that. To put up money for research into a system of free power would be to throw it away and violate, hell, betray the essence of everything modern history is supposed to be. And he goes on a little bit later to say, if such a thing is ever produced, Scarsdale Vibe was saying, it will mean the end of the world, not just as we know it, but as anyone knows it. It is a weapon, Professor. Surely you see that. The most terrible weapon the world has seen, designed to destroy not armies or materiel, but the very nature of exchange. Our economy's long struggle to evolve up out of the fish market anarchy of all battling, all of the rational systems of control whose blessings we enjoy at present. So he's scared not of anything other than losing his money, his power. And it terrifies him because Tesla, if this had worked, which you could really, I mean, the science behind it is pretty specious, but Tesla was also really, really far ahead of his time. Given, unlimited funding and resources to do it, who the hell knows? But yeah, that absolutely would have been a huge blow to commerce in a sense. I mean, you're creating this energy source that people don't have to pay for, and if you imagine the ramifications that would have specifically on the people who stood to profit from it, not just from producing it, but from all of the infrastructure that goes into that. All of that wealth would have just gone away. Like the potential to earn all of that would have just gone away, and they would not have had the opportunity to build on the back of what became of the electrical system and the electrical grid that came out of this whole era. So it would have been huge, and people like Scarsdale Vibe would have lost a lot, and that's what terrifies him.
Well, that would still be true now. Like for everyone who's listening, think about like your electric bill. All of that income that you pay to your utility provider, whether they're private or public, it would also go away. So that would still be a huge deal now. And there's a grand history of this happening as well. There's a video that you can watch of Henry Ford absolutely beating the shit out of a bumper that he made out of hemp material, and it's not denting, right? But was that the material he made his cars out of? No. He made his cars out of a material that was dentable and breakable, and you could, buy replacement parts for it. When you go back and talk about one of the inventors we covered earlier, who created the first ever electric car, that's in the 1800s. We're just now kind of getting electric cars in a mass-produced way in 2024.
But even then, the oil companies are fighting that tooth and nail.
Yeah, exactly. Marijuana ended up being illegal in this country because William Randolph Hearst didn't want to pay for a new paper processing plant. There is a long history of the exact kind of crap that Cody is talking about that runs all through not just American history, but global history.
Yeah, and I have another addition. It's not quite context or anything, but so the thing to consider here is that Nikola Tesla's idea of using the planet as a resonator circuit to transport power and allow anyone using a specific type of radio device to power whatever electrical components they wanted. Like the fact is, as far as I'm aware, and I am not an electrical engineer and I am not a physicist, but my understanding of that is that in terms of material science, as in materially founded science, the idea of being able to use the planet for such a purpose is theoretically possible, but would result in killing everybody.
I mean, you got to break a few eggs,
Well, yeah, there's that, but also there's the point I'm getting at, I guess, is that this guy Scarsdale Vibe walks around holding a globe. He is, and as the Finchen Wiki very helpfully points out, I don't have exclusively negative things to say. He says the essence of everything modern history is supposed to be, as though modern history is something he sees in hindsight, as though what would be convenient for him, as though the order of things that he would appreciate the most is the way that the world is inevitably going to go. And it's almost as though with this conversation of Scarsdale Vibe contracting someone like Vanderjuice to create a counter resonator to break it down. He is asking how much of our science has been determined, how much of that is possible, and how much of it has been shut down by people like Scarsdale Vibe. Is it a matter of it would kill everybody, or is that just a useful myth that they have propagated?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's to go back to the possibility of Tesla being able to do that. Again, the man was a genius. The man was way ahead of his time. He also had a lot of what would probably today be considered mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
He, especially towards the end of his life, became very reclusive, became hyperfixated. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was like spending thousands and thousands of dollars on a pigeon that he found in the park that he was trying to kind of nurse back into health. He was basically just kind of living I think he lived in a hotel where he had set aside certain rooms on the floor or something like that. It had to do with the number 3. He became really obsessive about certain things, especially people's clothing and their personal appearance. So he had a lot of very bizarre and outlandish ideas in addition to the very interesting and innovative ideas that he was pursuing scientifically. So a very interesting character and one, especially when you think about the duality of this book and everything that goes on with the duality and doubling and all that, that kind of plays into it as well. I think Tesla's a very interesting person to read about, and it makes for some interesting thought experiments as far as, what he might have been able to do had he gotten the level of recognition that someone like Edison had.
On the subject of Tesla, I forget where I came across this rumor or a reference to this rumor, but I believe that in the 90s, I think after Vineland came out, there's a rumor going around that I think was referenced in either newspapers or magazines or both, that Pynchon's next novel would be about Tesla, completely about Tesla. this is a bit conspiracy corner, but I do think that rumor, it probably stems from Pynchon at some point mentioning in a letter or verbally that he was, researching Tesla. I think this book in general is kind of an outgrowth of like cumulatively like years and years and years of Pynchon researching this time period, researching these different figures. Yeah, I do think that Pynchon probably, even though Tesla's not a major character in this book, I do think that Pynchon did a lot of research into his life.
I could also see a world where maybe the seed of this book started with more of a focus on this invention from Tesla and like running into the capitalist or commercial concerns of it and how that, could have maybe led to like a schizophrenic break or something like that, and then only for him to kind of realize that that wasn't as tenable of a storyline as he had anticipated. Like I could absolutely see how he would start at that point and then end up at this point.
Well, and in any conversation of historical figures who had big ideas, who died in squalor and mental despair, we have to be reminded of Ernest Hemingway and how
I thought you were going to say Howard Hughes.
No, a little more conspiratorial than that. With how Ernest Hemingway was diagnosed as schizophrenic and ended up, drinking himself to death on an island in a secluded house in Cuba because he believed the FBI was wiretapping him. And lo and behold, decades later, it turns out, yeah, the FBI was wiretapping him because they believed he was a communist asset.
Well, he did also work for the KGB for a time.
Oh no, yeah, absolutely. No, my point is that
which is even crazier.
Yeah, but is Tesla crazy because he believed that he could turn the world into a capacitor, a wireless capacitor that anyone could tap into? Is he crazy because he fell in love with a pigeon? Is he crazy because he wanted to turn the globe into a wireless capacitor that anyone could tap into, and due to forces and those forces outside of his control who saw the threat in him wanted to turn him into somebody who falls in love with a pigeon? These are the questions that are being raised.
Yeah, these questions about him, and then I would say you could make similar questions about stuff that happens like with Lou Bass Knight or even Weed Otman, from Vineland with the brainwashing that takes place there. Any other thoughts that anyone has from this last scene of the chapter?
My last one would be that you see the start of this scene, the start of the small caps to the end of the chapter, where Scarsdale Vibe is spending all this time talking about the big idea reasons of why, no, we must stop Tesla's resonating circuit idea. And then the minute that the professor deploys some of the capitalist reasoning against him of like, well, how much is being spent on the other side of this? It sounds like I should be getting that much. Vibe resorts to underhandedness and saying, hey, now I thought you were an ideas guy, not some, what's the specific term he uses? A damn horse trader without mercy. Just, for people like Scarsdale Vibe, these justifications are fluid. They fit what they feel they need to say.
Well, and to a certain extent, that also defines the fact that they make reality what they want it to be. Like that you reach a certain amount of wealth and power, that it makes you have the ability to sort of say like, this is what I want this situation to be. This is what I want this to mean. This is what I want to happen here, or this is what I want this person to do for me. Going back to the philosophical thought that we had talked about, like you can reach a certain point where the money you have can create reality around you. Donald Trump is probably the most cartoonish example of somebody who does that, but plenty of people that are, very wealthy do it for very, nefarious or very self-motivated interest that is a bit more tactfully done. He's certainly doing the same thing here.
Mm-hmm.
We do also get another name of a strange legal firm, Somble, Struhl, and Fleshway. It's quite you have a whole elucidation of this, Cody.
I went in more in depth on this than I should have, but what I came away with, if you run these through Scottish translation. Somble translates to sleepy. Strool is to urinate in a forceful stream. And fleshway, I think, kind of goes without any definition needed. But whether or not that was the intended definition of those words is hard to say. But I do find it interesting that those definitions popped up for attorneys, which, I think anyone who's read any of Pynchon's work kind of gets the idea of how he feels about both attorneys and real estate agencies.
It's his two favorite things.
Yep.
As a last note on this, I really enjoy the final sort of quote of this chapter, where it says, "More and more in recent weeks he found himself approaching likewise the condition of an empty cylinder, only intermittently occupied by intelligent thought. Was this the right thing to do? Should he even be here? The criminality in the room was almost palpable. Ray certainly didn't care for any of it, and the boys today, even in their unusual worldliness, had regarded him with something like apprehension. Would any sum the New York lawyers might be suggesting now be worth the loss of that friendship?" And so I like that because, not only does it showcase that this particular character has some second thoughts about engaging in this whole enterprise, which means that he's not a totally terrible person, but also it does set up the Chums of Chance as a, I guess I'll say, woefully innocent group that even though they also serve the interests of power and the moneyed class by all accounts so far, they don't have an understanding of what any of that means.
That comes into play later too. We find out, and I love the line: "The criminality in the room was almost palpable." Jesus, that's a good line.
It is, or just sort of him comparing himself to an empty hat that he's just sort of become a vessel for this evil class of society to do what they want. Yeah. It's really, really good stuff.
Cross out one of my candidates for favorite quote.
I'm so sorry.
You better be.
Chapter 5, if no one has anything else from Chapter 4, begins with the Chums of Chance being permitted ground leave to go to the Chicago Fair. And there's this great line in here that the celebration possesses the exact degree of fictitiousness to permit the boys access and agency. The harsh, non-fictional world waited outside the White City's limits, held off for this brief summer, making the entire commemorative season beside Lake Michigan at once dreamlike and real. This is good for a couple of reasons. One, it again sets up kind of what the purpose of these first 2 pages is, as far as this question of whether or not the Chums of Chance are real people, or if they are in some way fictitious. The White City itself has to be somewhat fictitious for them to sort of gain access to it. Like, for these boys to exist there requires a degree of non-reality. And there's just sort of this additional layer of analysis of the fact that the White City is fictional and the city around it is non-fictional. The inventions being put on display at the World's Fair, the sort of spirit that it represents, the sort of whitewashing of history that it represents as well, by being an anniversary of Columbus's arrival at the New World, with its literally white stucco material that they had to also constantly repaint. If you go back and read a history of the fair, the material that they had used needed to be good enough to stand for a few months, but not permanent. And so as a result, they constantly had to have people go through and repaint everything white. If you go to Chicago now, one of the statues from the fairgrounds is still there. And the Museum of Science and Industry that is across from that statue is also still there, but it was entirely rebuilt in permanent materials. So you can still see some of this stuff from the White City if you go down to Chicago nowadays. But it was not built to last, much like the kind of fictitious understanding of what Columbus's discovery really meant in reality for people is also just as fictitious. And then you have the non-fiction of this like dirty, smoggy, sort of awful Chicago that surrounds it. This place where there's people getting their fingers cut off in meatpacking plants and getting crippled, working too many hours of work, and these different immigrant experiences that are varying degrees of horrible to acceptable, and just sort of this like smog that chokes the air. It's this great juxtaposition between those two things. And as we continue there, we figured out that they're going up in the airship with their I guess we'll say, welcomed guest from the White City investigations. And there is a description here of the fact that they have the perfect sort of opportunity to spy on people because everyone can see them, but they can't see if they're looking at them. This is pointed out by the Pynchon Wiki as being the exact design of the panopticon style of prison, where all of the prison guards are in this sort of central tower that has sort of blackout windows, where the prisoners can see the tower, but they can't see if they're being watched at that particular moment. And we figure out that the man who's been invited aboard by White City Investigations is none other than Lou Bassnight. He mentions that he first broke in his telescopic gear on the Ferris wheel. Some real history is that the first Ferris wheel was debuted at the World's Fair in Chicago. Well, I can't imagine how exciting that was in 1893.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've been on a Ferris wheel since I was very much a child, but I'd imagine it was a real source of amusement back then. And then this leads us to this question that Lou Bassnight asked. It says, Lou obligingly tried to remember Wild West, African explorers, the usual adventure stuff, but you boys, you're not storybook characters, he had a thought. Are you? They might be. We had actually a very good email from a listener that we'll eventually get to when we go through those things from all the different sources that people can communicate with us on. But there's one line in here that kind of kicked me off on this thought process as I was doing my notes, where this listener says, I guess the Chums aren't the only ones who are children acting in an adult world, but they're a lot more protected by living in a boy adventure novel. Most of these other children in Against the Day have no such protection, which sort of leads me to kind of the summary of the notes I had off of this quote, where it's entirely possible that the Chums that they are. The chapter itself opens with that fictional versus non-fictional comparison of the White City and the surroundings of the city of Chicago. You have the fact that this fair celebrates Columbus's quote-unquote discovery of America, but is also a de facto celebration of the modern society of America itself. Inventions get shown there that will sort of advance the world forward down its commerce-obsessed pathway, but the peoples that have been subjugated are locked out of it all. The White City is the fictional mythological ideal of America, and the fairgrounds surrounding it depict a reality of how dark and evil it all is, and especially the kind of subjugation that it was built off the back of. So you have this one framework of fiction that helps you kind of swallow the bitter pill of the actual evil that represents. And then, in the same way, the Chumps of Chance clearly work in the interests of that same commerce and the capital holding class, but because they're safely inside the narrative of a boy's adventure story, they don't see what they actually are doing or what it actually means. When asked what Lou read as a child, that was the beginning of the quote, he says, Wild West, African explorers, the usual adventure stuff. And when you divorce that from its mythological context, those settings represent nothing but atrocities committed in the name of modernity. The slaughter of natives, the pillaging of natural resources, the killing of animals, or the leveling of whole acres of natural land, which obviously, as we know from other books, Pynchon considers Edenic. And then, of course, everything gets underscored by the following quote from Randolph, where it says, although the longer a fellow's name has been in magazines, the harder it is to tell fiction from nonfiction. There's also references to Wyatt Earp or Nellie Bly. These particular people are highly mythologized figures who, the longer you kind of look into them, the more you realize that a lot of that stuff either wasn't true or was embellished or potentially, whitewashes some of the negative aspects. And this provides an excellent segue into the whole next section where Lou Bassnight can't even remember what he did and whether or not he may have done anything. But all of that gets to this idea that, are the Chums of Chance real people? Probably, but there is a very real possibility that the framework they exist in, as a result of that mythologized and fictionalized aspect of it, leads them to be protected from the harsh sort of non-fiction realities of the world they're actually navigating through.
The question of the realness of the Chums is a really interesting discussion point. And I really like everything that you just elucidated there, Kate, about how essentially either reality is the reality or both are at the same. It's a very Schrodinger's cat situation.
Yeah.
And it's almost, and this is, I don't want to jump too far ahead discussing today, but when we get into chapter 6 and the sort of time that exists in between their adventures, it almost feels like this is what it would be like to be an NPC in a video game, where you have a set of actions that you do, but then when you're in between parts of the story that you're a part of, there's just nothing happening. It's almost like this existential breakdown of your reality where, like, I'm here, but I have no purpose to serve until my part of the story comes back into play. So I just have to sit here and exist until that comes back into being. And until then, I don't have anything. There's nothing. There's no meaning. There's no value in my life. I just exist until I am needed. And at that point, I can, the adventure starts up again and I can have that comfort and that sense of belonging and everything. But there's a weird horror that hides behind that. If you really think about their existence in this sort of, conflict of whether or not they are real. And it really, again, to go into the doubling thing, the idea of their jovial and sort of exuberant existence and the nature of how they're very excited and very kind of, gung-ho about their adventures when they're happening, but then when we see the other side of that when it's not happening, it's very different dynamic that plays at that time.
Yeah, and it further underlines that whole dichotomy between the almonology of spirit of Hegel and then the re ipso, the thing in itself of the phenomenology at the beginning of what we term today the modern period. You have these narrative people, the Chums of Chance, interacting with these phenomenological people, as far as we've seen literally everyone else. But the Chums are provisional.
And if you want to read more about that, Red Shirts by John Scalzi is a great place to start. But no, you're right. They're living the life of like a shopkeeper in a video game when nobody is in there currently harassing them about how much their stuff costs.
Mm-hmm.
That description of sort of NPCs, or like Will said, as provisional people, is a good way to put it. And you're right, that section in chapter 6 where they're just like, just between whatever they're doing next is there's a very, very real tone shift there for sure.
I do also want to point out that it's interesting that when Lou mentions that he reads, I guess I read the sports pages mostly, and Chick's response is, I guess we don't have to worry about the anarchist question. Is he implying that people who like sports can't be anarchists?
I think he's implying that people who watch sports are stupid.
Okay. Either way, I'm offended.
It's like that episode of Seinfeld where Jerry assumes the doorman's reading the sports page.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I think Chick is totally saying, look, you mostly read the sports section. We don't have to worry about you being with the times, those being the anarchist times.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
And there's also the facet of again, if these characters are self-aware that they are provisional fictional characters, then can you read that as Pynchon saying that, sports is a distraction from, in the way the Olympic Games were provisioned to be, let's stop war, let's just run real fast and see who runs fastest, and then that's the war these days. That's what the sports are for, is to keep you away from the actual war.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, stuff like that is a distraction from what's really going on. Absolutely. I think you're certainly onto something. That if you're really invested in what your sports teams are doing, how are you spending time, I guess, organizing your local union or your local workplace?
Yeah.
From there, we kind of zoom in on Lou Bassnight as a character, and we learn that he's got an interesting past. He, I guess, best. I'll just leave it to the book itself to describe. Fine with Lou, who wasn't even sure what anarchists were exactly, though the word was sure in the air. He was not in the detective business out of political belief. He just sort of wandered into it by way of a sin he was supposed once to have committed. As to the specifics of this lapse, well, good luck. Lou couldn't remember what he'd done or hadn't done, or even when. Those who didn't know either still acted puzzled, as if he were sending out rays of iniquity. Those who did claim to remember, all too well, kept giving him sad looks which soon, it being Illinois, soured into what was known as moral horror. First of all, Pinchon, between this and the Indian apple or whatever, I don't appreciate your characterization of people who live in the Midwest. As a lifelong resident of this region of the country, it's very nice here.
It does get put through the ringer pretty thoroughly, though.
But all this is to say that like he went on to be denounced in the local newspapers. Newsboys made up lurid headlines about him, which they shouted all through the civic mobilities morning and evening, making a point of pronouncing his name disrespectfully. We can guess how that is. Women in intimidating hats glared at him with revulsion. He became known as the upstate, downstate beast. It would have helped if he could remember, but all he could produce was this peculiar haze. The experts he went to for advice had little to tell him. Past lives, some assured him. Future lives, said other confident swamis. Spontaneous hallucination, diagnosed the more scientific among them. Perhaps, one beaming Oriental suggested, it was hallucinating you. Very helpful, thanks, Lou murmured, tried to leave, only to find that the door would not open. A formality. Too many bank drafts come back unhonored. Here's cash. Can I go? And your anger has cooled. Consider what I have told you. It's no use to me. I love that interaction he has with whoever that is.
Great.
But the biggest thing that this reminds me of is actually, again, the stuff with Weed Atman, where Weed Atman is brainwashed and like made to forget certain things, made to become like paranoid and on edge, and he doesn't remember any of that happening to him. Like when he's trying to remember his time at the dentist office, all he can really remember is being in the waiting room and signing forms and coming back and forth, and then sometimes looking up at something in the chair, but then beyond that, he has nothing. And of course, this leads him to kind of betray his entire movement that he started. This leads him to betray sort of his system of belief. This leads him to become, obviously, a thanatoid and sort of put him in the position that the powers that be, so to speak, want him to be in. I don't know if there's any textual support for the idea, but my kind of conspiracy corner idea is that the same thing happened to Lou Bassnight. He was manipulated in some way to end up in a position where he was forced into service at not the Pinkertons, but a Pinkerton-like agency doing work for the powers that be, even though he doesn't even understand what that work is. And that to kind of set him up to be in that position required him going through whatever this is. That's at least my kind of early read without the benefit of whatever future context may exist.
Yeah, Lou's whole backstory is a really interesting one. And I love the ambiguity of how this is all presented. And I didn't really make the connection with Weed Atman before, but I see it now. And I definitely, that's going to be on my mind as we keep going through. I do also like the fact that one of his old coworkers, Wensleydale, mentions to him that you have destroyed your name.
Yeah.
Like, that is such a harsh thing to tell somebody.
That's something that you'd say to Hitler. Like, there can't be another Hitler.
Yeah. You have done something so catastrophically bad that your own actual name is sullied forever now.
Yeah. And especially when you go back to what Randolph said about, if someone's name is in the paper enough times.
Yeah.
It just gets fictionalized. That same thing probably could have happened to Lou.
Well, and I'm glad that we finally, all of us, over the course of this podcast, have made it to this section, because I can finally justify my I'm sure infuriating statements in the past about why characters make decisions or why characters say certain things as because they have to. I kind of read this in conjunction with the previous conversation about within the book of the fictionality of the Chums of Chance, and then our conversation about their liminal presence between calls to action, along with my love for overanalyzing the words of various gurus in Pynchon's books. I come out the end of analyzing this as basically Lou Bassnight didn't exist before this. That he is a hallucination of the book, in the sense of there needs to be a character to negotiate between the White City investigations and the Chums of Chance, and to serve his further purpose as a character in the book. And him not being able to remember what happened before we will find going forward that like he doesn't remember things that aren't stated by the narrator about him. They aren't ever mentioned. He only exists insofar as the book necessitates him to exist. And so it hallucinating him is the narrative of him being the upstate downstate beast, but it's also the narrative of him as a character in this book.
That's interesting.
That is a very interesting take. That's something that I will have to think about as we continue on.
Yeah. I've always kind of seen Lou's backstory and introduction into the story as sort of similar to Lost Highway, where Fred Madsen had done something so horrific that he essentially created a schism within his own psyche that led to the creation of another version of himself and a sort of attempt to right the wrongs and have a do-over at things. But the past kept kind of like infiltrating and forcing its way in. But I like this idea. This is a really interesting way of approaching Lou's character.
Yeah, and if we are going to insist upon, as we must as the readers of this book, characterizing him as a being with a fictional phenomenology, that's all still there. That's why he's doing those things. But for us from the outside, he is just the character. He is just the words. He's the agglomeration of things we are told about him.
That would actually make a lot of sense too in context of the fact that what Lou specifically states on the previous page is that he doesn't know what an anarchist is, but in the next chapter when it goes through his history, he's been to several union meetings.
Yeah, he's very familiar with
but the narrator hadn't stated that yet.
Yeah.
I interpreted that part as like that's happening concurrently with him working with the Chums' Chance. That's like part of his job after the World's Fair starts.
Yeah, I actually agree with Luke here. I think that's what's going on there. But for meat function.
I've come away from this with a lot more to think about this particular character. We get an interaction then between him and his wife, Troth. That name means faith or loyalty or truth. Strangely enough, Troth is actually trying to get him to come back home, or I suppose maybe not strangely enough, given what her name actually means, but gives up pretty quickly as soon as Lou kind of makes it known that he's not going to. Which again, if we're looking at which wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, but if we're looking at his narrative need to be here, that would explain the only reason why he would A, give up so easily, and also why B, his wife would also give up so easily. So what he decides to do after this interaction with his wife is just kind of go wandering through the city of Chicago until he eventually finds himself in what is likely a immigrant neighborhood, sort of filled with culture and references to cultures and peoples that he doesn't understand. And eventually he finds himself in a courtyard within a courtyard where there is a group of men and women engaged in, quote, a slow ritual movement, a country dance almost, though Lou, pausing to watch, was not sure what country. Soon they were gazing back as if in some way they knew him and all about his troubles. When their business was done, they invited him over to a table under an awning, where all at once, over root beer and Saratoga chips, Lou found himself confessing everything, which in fact wasn't much. What I need is some way to atone for whatever it is I've done. I can't keep on with this life. Just as a fun note, Saratoga chips are just potato chips. They were invented in Saratoga, so for a while during this time frame, that's what they were referred to as. And we then have a back and forth between Lou and someone named Drave about the fact that there was a way for him to achieve deliverance and for him to sort of pay penance. And even though he doesn't have any money, that's okay. There's another way that he can pay for it. And so they sent him off to the Estonia Hotel, which is, as Luke mentioned in the beginning of the show, a very Kafka-esque sort of location. Did you have anything you wanted to expand on about that, Luke?
Not too much. Like I said at the beginning, it is somewhat reminiscent of the way Kafka describes physical locations throughout his work, in that it's labyrinthine, mazy. It's another way to put that. Kind of hard to picture, or maybe not hard to picture, but hard to kind of visually or wrap your head around mentally. It seems somewhat endless.
But it actually reminds me of another fictional locale. in the context of a book that I think is fairly well documented as a direct influence on Pynchon, is Invisible Man by
Ralph
Ellison.
Ellison?
Yeah, the Cathonia is the hotel and dining club that the Invisible Man makes his acquaintance with the Communist Party in New York. Very similar to these kinds of what strike me as kind of like weird Taoist monks of sorts. All their discussion of, things being penance being separated from sin, and the kind of senseless absurdity of all these different things. Because Estonia, as far as I'm aware, was not a real hotel. And the old-fashioned spelling is accurate to how people spelled Estonia, but it also is how you would spell Cathonia with a ES instead of CH, which also sent me on this whole train of trying to understand where Estonia got its name from, which has to do with estuaries, also known as a river delta, where streams are broken into smaller parts as they flow into the wider wash of the sea.
Are those called Estonias?
Well, it's in Latin, aestuus or something,
Oh, okay.
with estuary. And Estonia, it is speculated, was given that name as a Roman province because it was a place with marshes, basically.
At the hotel, he is given acceptance via pneumatic tube of his his room and board being covered, and he is then taken by Herschel up to his room. And I think this paragraph is maybe one of the funniest in these section of chapters, where it says Herschel was a large one for his calling, looking less like a uniformed jockey than an ex-pugilist. The two of them scarcely fit into the tiny electric elevator, which turned out to be more frightening than the worst carnival ride Lou had ever been on. The blue arcing from loosely dangling wires whose woven insulation was frayed and thick with greasy dust filled the little space with a strong smell of ozone. Herschel had his own notions of elevator etiquette, trying to start conversations about national politics, labor unrest, even religious controversy, any of which it might take an ascent of hours into lofty regions no high iron pioneer had yet dared, which at that time, for context, was about 10 stories, even to begin to discuss. More than once they were obliged to step out into refuse-filled corridors, negotiate iron ladders, cross dangerous catwalks not visible from the streets, only to reboard the fiendish conveyance at another one of its stops, at times traveling not even vertically, until at last reaching a floor with a room somehow cantilevered out in the wind, autumnal today and unremitting off Lake Michigan.
It is. I do love that, and I love it is a very, as you mentioned, a very hilarious and awkward encounter that they have in the elevator. I also, in rereading this section, I started realizing that this works perfectly as a sort of first entry point into his sort of conditioning. This idea of, rather than making small talk about the weather or sports, Herschel's trying to gauge his reaction to the kind of things that he'd be investigating regarding anarchists, national politics, labor unrest, religious controversy. That's all things that he would be investigating while working for the WCI. And then on top of that, you're intentionally, disorienting this person by, riding in the elevator for a brief period of time, getting out, meandering through the building just to get back on the elevator, walking through these weird passages that don't seem to exist from other areas. It's all a part of that process of disorientation and conditioning to get him ready for whatever the process that they're going to put him through is.
Yeah, well, and especially too when you look at what his moment of enlightenment is in chapter 6, or his moment of enlightenment is just like everything is as it is, sort of in a very Zen, sort of stereotypical way. You're exposing him to something so insane as at the beginning of his training process that is the only option you'd come to. It's just like, okay, it is what it is, and there's not anything I can do about this. He also learns exactly how it is that he's going to pay for his time there. He's going to pay for it through service to the staff or other people there. Herschel basically immediately upon dropping him off at his room says, "Here's some money, go get me some whiskey and some ice, and hurry back before the ice melts." Which which Lou is unable to do. He does.
Oh yeah,
he does eventually. He does eventually get there, but the ice is completely melted.
And then he has to get hit with the remembrance stick.
Yes, the remembrance stick.
Which Drave was, what is it? He's unhealthily amused by using.
It's so good. It's so good. And then we have this very interesting conversation on the sort of concept of penance between Lou and Drave. Do any of you guys have any thoughts on that particular conversation?
It's really interesting because there is this sort of intentional, what's the word I'm looking for? Not obfuscation. I can never say that word. But it's sort of an intentional contradiction within the concept that he's presenting of is penance important or is it not important? And it goes back and forth, and it seems to be that it could be either one. It all really kind of depends on the person. But I don't know. I haven't really been able to fully kind of come away with where I land on that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it ties back into my broader totalizing theory of how Pynchon uses characters in all of his books, but especially this one. One quote that I think is fairly important is, "It's nothing supernatural. Most people have a wheel riding up on a wire or some rails in the street, some kind of guide or groove to keep them moving in the direction of their destiny. But you keep bouncing free, avoiding penance and thereby definition." And when Lou asks, "So you're trying to put me back on tracks?" Drave basically dismisses that and says, "Look, you don't need a furrow to plow. Delirium is going out of this furrow. You are doing this delirium intentionally right now, because the penance is not about making penance for the sin you've committed. The penance is to be done because that is what must be done. And in the context of the narrative, that's what he does as a character. But as a narrativizing individual who we are constructing by reading the book, as we reach at the end of this chapter, he is a flaneur. He is there to be an intersection point of meaning and observation. So just do your job, shut up.
Mm-hmm.
And even though Drave and his cohort clearly believe that there is no ultimate purpose to the job, it's not a matter of like, this is the order of the world, and it's not a matter of this must be done for these reasons. It is just you do it to do it.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing in this conversation, to go down the religious angle of it, is that he first asks if he's Catholic, and his response is that no, he's not Catholic, he's Presbyterian. And then the answer that Drave gives him after he says he's Presbyterian is a very, well, how should I say it? It can be seen almost as a description of Reformed Christian theology, if you were to simplify it greatly. Mm. And that is what Presbyterianism subscribes to. So Presbyterianism is a branch off of sort of Calvinist Christianity, or Reformed Christianity, as it's commonly called. And Reformed Christianity or Calvinism is oftentimes the branch of the church, especially as someone who used to be a minister within that type of theological framework, associated most with predestination, or the lack of free will in some cases, is how people who are trying to kind of preach against it would point out. And so this description of many people believe that there's a mathematical correlation between sin, penance, and redemption. That would be a Catholic understanding of it. The more you sin, the more penance you have to do, the longer you're in limbo, so on and so forth. And then, as he says, more sin, more penance, and so forth. Our own point has been that there is no connection. All the variables are independent. You do penance not because you have sinned, but because it is your destiny. You are redeemed not through doing penance, but because it happened, or doesn't happen. You could very easily make the same argument for an understanding of a Calvinist worldview of salvation. That you are chosen by God because you're chosen by God. You are saved by God because God chose to save you you can't do anything about that. That just happens. Now, historically, there has been a disagreement among two different types of Calvinism, which I don't know if that's what he's commenting on here, or what, where one of them says that God chooses people and redeems people based upon their behaviors, as in, like, God saw the entirety of human history when he made the world, and so if he saw that you accepted his truth and all of that later on down the line, then he chooses to save you. And then one branch of it just says that God sort of went, yeah, you, not you, not you, not you, not you, so on and so forth. And so everything that follows after that happens because that's how it happened. And that's how God laid it out to happen. In other words, you can't lose your salvation. You can't, you can't not do enough penance or anything like that, because you're going to end up as one of those people selected by God. That's just what it is. And we know from a lot of Pynchon's work, and I'm just sort of kind of spitballing at this point, so if this doesn't make any sense, we can cut it or whatever, that this idea of the redeemed or the elect and the unredeemed or the preterite is a big theme in a lot of his work. That in some cases, historical contexts pick those people in the same way that God does. That's a huge part of Mason and Dixon, for example. You have Mason and Dixon who are, if I'm not mistaken, liken themselves to being on a track towards a destiny point that they're being pushed towards at one point in the novel, and that they have been, chosen, or the elect, or whatever word you want to use there, as opposed to the other people who could have been in their position or not. And I think that if you're looking at this framework within, you could look at it in a number of ways. If it turns out that he is just a character in the story, and everything that kind of will elucidate it otherwise, that he is a member of the elect, and he has to go through this because he goes through this, and he's going to be doing the penance because that's what he has to do to get into the position to work for White City Investigation, and he has to be in that position to do whatever it is that he does for the rest of the book. And the people who don't are the preterite. Or you can also look at it from a perspective of the capital T they, or capitalism, or whatever. That, like, he was selected not for any particular reason, he just was. That they manufactured the story about him to get him into a position where they could, like, brainwash him or change him to their own, ends, and then send him out onto the world. So I think that when you get into, like, the actual words that are used there, yeah, it does seem like they're like this kind of weird Zen enlightened group, and I'm sure that there's certainly, like, a lot of other influences on that, but reading through it, to me, coming from that sort of religious tradition, that's what I actually see it there a lot more.
I have to agree. I mean, it recasts that interpretation recasts the story of, well, what did I do? What did I do? As the question of, why is humanity damned from the outset? Why are Adam and Eve covering themselves with fig leaves? Well, it doesn't matter. You do the penance. It doesn't matter whether you're getting into heaven or not. You must do it because you don't know whether you're chosen to be saved or not. So you must do the penance in that Puritan Calvinist framework.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next section of the chapter?
I guess this is as good a time as any for me to bring up the fact that Lou Bosnight's name is maybe the most discussed name of this book online, and I just
They
wanted
went
to...
on quite a while in the Pynchon wiki about it.
Yeah, and I had just a couple of addenda to the Pynchon wiki's discussion of that.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they, as Luke and I before we started recording were discussing, there's kind of a single-minded aspect to the Pynchon wiki's discussion. I think while everything in the Pynchon wiki I think is worth reading for anyone listening to us who hasn't read it yet, I think it's all meaningful interpretation, and I'm going to build on that. So first off, they say Bos is French for low, although Bas Nuit means nothing in French, and it's literally true. But it also Bas Nuit means, like, it literally would mean low night, but also just like beneath night in that kind of general symbolic sense of like the lowness of night. And I want to say honestly, it was Luke like over a year ago now, discussing another book, brought up Lou Bosnight's name as being interpretable as Lou Ba Night, as in a sound similar to flew by night. But that also mean you also have to consider Lou as a name as having that etymology, because if you're doing the pun on Boz and night, you have to do the etymological digging into Lou, which is established as coming from Lewis, which etymologically stems from the what is now usually pronounced and discussed as Clovis, which is according to Wikipedia, an old Frankish name, something along the lines of Ludovic, which leads to Louis, Ludwig, Louis, and Ludwig. Ludwig is composed of basically words that together mean like brazen or famous warrior. So you can, through just smushing words together, through staring at etymology long enough, you can get to an interpretation of Louis Bosnight, meaning the brazen warrior of the underworld, or of the cover of night, or that which is done under the cover of night. And there's some other stuff where like the roots of Ludwig, Louis, intersecting with the Celtic god Lugus, which has a lot of meanings, but it's something along the lines of a king of gods who was Mercury. By the Romans who documented it, was situated as synonymous with Mercury or Hermes, which is very symbolically resonant with the tarot discussions in some of Pynchon's other books, where Hermes is associated with the Fool. That is kind of defined by that sin penance discussion and the kind of the whole ideology of these people who have taken Lou in for the time being. I don't know enough about tarot to discuss it, but the Fool as a symbol, at least today, has come to imply all of these, the furrowlessness bounding, which a lot of Pynchon's protagonists signify. So anyway, those are my addenda.
I like that better than what's on the Pynchon wiki.
Mm-hmm. Where there's two people fighting with each other.
Yeah.
Well, and we have to give them credit. I mean, they're not wrong. I mean,
no. I'm not saying they're wrong. I just I like your interpretation of it. I think it plugs in better.
Yeah, I struggle with believing in the bitches ain't shit interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
But the Lou Bass Night thing is there.
So after this conversation between Drave and Lugos, we get a page break, and then we figure out that spring has now arrived. So we've probably gone almost a year now, as far as from when his backstory kind of started to where he's at now. And we learn that he's basically sort of done. He's sitting on a train, and he's just sort of people watching in a way that Pynchon likes to do when people are on trains in his novels.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly he has this kind of moment where it says he understood that things were exactly what they were. It seemed more than he could bear. So he reaches this sudden kind of point of enlightenment where he just goes, it is what it is, so to speak. And then this kind of is the final sort of transformation point for all of his sort of training or service or servitude or whatever penance he was doing. And he doesn't go back to the hotel. From here on, instead, he goes down the sidewalk and he enters into a seemingly random cigar store. Does anyone know if the actual history of how humidors worked is they soaked bricks in water overnight? And
I was completely unaware of that, but it makes sense.
At least insofar as like common myth goes, I think that is what people believe happened. I don't know if that's historically accurate.
which is crazy. I don't know how you discover that works.
That's the same way you figure a lot of stuff out, just random observation and chance happening.
Mm-hmm. So he goes into a cigar store, and then suddenly the person working behind the counter asks him what the box on the bottom shelf contains as far as the amount of cigars that are left in it. And Lou's just able to tell him. Then he asks what it was that just went by outside the window. Lou's able to tell him. And then he then says, amazing. And then I just Lou's responsive. Not really, just nobody asked.
I have this Sherlock Holmesian ability to have perfect recall.
Uh-huh.
No one ever bothered to ask me about it.
Yeah, so why is it that big of a deal? The proprietor of the cigar store then asks him if he's had breakfast, and he takes him to the cafeteria next door to the cigar store, and he introduces him to Nate Privet, who was obviously previously introduced in the book as the sort of founder or leader of the White City investigations. And this is again where if like you're going to take a particular interpretation of this story as being like his backstory was set up for him by the powers that be, he was put on this path to sort of become a detective for those powers that be. This would be one of those cases where you'd have sort of a plot point to point towards it. You know, he just happens to wander into a cigar store that just happens to be run by a guy who knows the founder of White City Investigations, and that guy happens to be eating pancakes next door.
Mm-hmm.
Just a lot of those different sort of coincidences that kind of pile up to make you think that maybe he's on a path, even though Drave sort of has told him he's needing to be productively delirious. But in reality, he's just moved him from one path into a different one, most likely. And he sits down, and Nate Privet explains to him that over a giant stack of pancakes, towering, as it says, that they're in need of new detectives as explosions go off in the distance, which he proclaims are ironworkers' unions striking or engaging in some kind of organized labor activity. And he calls them anarchistic scum, and that he wants them to come work for him. In fact, he's so shocked at his abilities, which have not been elucidated. There's no reason for him to think that this guy should be a detective. A random cigar store, proprietor wandered into the cafeteria with him and went, "Here's this guy," and then presumably maybe told him about his abilities at recall. And then suddenly Nate was just like, "Well, why haven't the Pinkertons requested your services?" Again, it's all very neat and tidy, and we get the notice here that the Pinkertons have so much money that it's almost too much for someone not to sign up. This is actually true. The Pinkertons were extremely well funded because everything was being funneled to them through government contract and government works. Like a lot of the stuff they did to break up union organizing, or to prompt rioting, or to like literally kill striking workers, or infiltrate places to act as strike breakers. A lot of that was funded by the federal government with vast sums of money. The Pinkertons still exist, which is kind of a shocking thing to me. How it is that anyone would just feel comfortable signing up to work for that company is pretty crazy. But they still exist, and purportedly from the research I did, they still pay incredibly well, especially when compared to other sort of security guard jobs or executive protection services. Funny enough, they're actually, I landed on the Pinkerton website earlier today just doing general research, and they do have a statement distancing themselves from their past activities. Essentially basically saying that, like, oh, we don't really do that anymore.
Yeah, wink.
And then just for like shits and giggles, I looked at their careers page, and they're actually looking to hire somebody in the town next to the town I live in.
Is this your way of saying you're leaving the show to go be a Pinkerton, and we're all just going to end up on some watch list?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. This has been a long-running...
You're playing the long game on us, yeah.
For me to find a group of subversive people online and break up
corral us into
their little clubhouse.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and as we've established in the previous episode, we are all okay with that. We are big fans of the Pinkerton Detective Agency and anything they may or may not stand for.
Yeah, 100%. it may be that you had the creepiest slogan of any corporation that's ever existed in history. We never sleep, but that's okay. That makes sense for the work that you do. Yeah, let the Pinkertons come after a niche podcast about a even more niche author in the American canon of literature.
They'll have to get through 2.5 hours of this episode just to even
That's
find out what we
true.
said about them.
That's true. So after that, he decides to start working for White City Investigations, and we sort of get an idea that what he really enjoys about it is the fact that it kind of allows him to be invisible. That his role there is sort of a investigator, or I guess maybe professional noticer, kind of gives him this anonymity that he especially didn't used to have. You know, when you look at his life prior to this to now, there was a bunch of like people harassing him on the street, and there was newspaper articles being written about him. And then now, seemingly, everybody's forgotten about him, and he also has access to quite a veritable treasure trove of disguises to wear in order to kind of navigate through life unnoticed, or at least noticed less, and he gets to make money off of it. And it's a very very appealing thing for him. But it's also clear that, like, you know, to him, he has a bit of a more anarchistic sensibility running through him. You know, he says that he doesn't really have much interest in money, that there's more to life than wages, which
But then immediately walks that back.
Is, yeah, when he realizes that his job is his potential job is in danger, he just stops.
Give me a few minutes with that one.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, that obviously sets up the fact that he'll eventually go to a union meeting and potentially some more development with his character later. And then you had a conspiracy corner, Cody?
Yeah, I was thinking about this morning when I was rereading these sections. I have the idea, and I'm not 100% sold on my own idea just yet, but I'm going to keep exploring this as we go through here. But there's always talk of Pugnax being the stand-in for Pynchon in this novel, which I can see where that's coming from, and I've kind of always operated under that idea. I get the feeling more that it might be Lou. The scene where he's going through the sort of conversion process of being sort of worn down and brainwashed, for lack of a better term, feels very much like what corporations tend to do to people to sort of get them to stay into that mindset and buy into the idea of it's good to be doing this for the company, and it's good to do this for the country and the economy and all that, which very much feels like a Boeing kind of thing that I would imagine would have grated at Pynchon quite a lot, especially when you get into the whole anti-anarchy side of those corporations and the Pinkertons, and how pro-corporate they are and how pro-corporate the world has kind of become since then. And then you have this guy who, you know, finds this group of adventurers who are these fictional characters, but he can insert himself into their story and be a part of that and live in that world and kind of bring a meaning to himself and to them as well, that, you know, they can become friends and writing these stories like his author friends, you know, Farina and you know, everyone else that he was running with at that time. But at some point he has to leave them to go elsewhere for any number of, you know, whether or not it's Lou having to, you know, being reassigned, or Pynchon choosing to move and go to, you know, Mexico or California or parts of Texas where he was at that part of his life in the 70s. And the anonymity that comes with what he's doing of Lou as this sort of people watcher, and his ability to disappear into the background and put on these disguises and people watch essentially and get an idea of how the world works. And especially now that I'm thinking of you know, Will's mention of Lou being this character insert intentionally, who doesn't necessarily have a backstory until it is needed and written for him, very much makes me think that this is kind of Pynchon's way of putting himself into his own story and allowing him to be the character who's the character that drives sort of other characters' storylines and moves their stories. I don't know, just kind of something I'm toying with.
To be a bit of a dick about it. Well, metaphysically, all characters are simply an instantiation of the of the
Sure.
author's perspective. But no, and I think you're not wrong though. I think that is kind of what Lou is doing. He is like Oedipa or any protagonist, in that dismissive sense. But like Oedipa and like Doc Sportello, like these are alternate history versions of Pynchon's self, right? Lou is someone who he clearly sees a lot of himself in for all of those reasons you just listed out. And if he weren't an author, if he weren't the kind of person who descends up into the imaginary space to create fictional worlds, he would probably be just like Lou. So I think you're right. I think that's a very real aspect of Lou's character.
Yeah, I think there's some real credibility to that for sure. Any other thoughts on chapter 5 before we get to chapter 6?
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask. There's this line on page 43. Next thing he knew, he was on the payroll, noticing how every time he entered a room, somebody was sure to remark ostensibly to somebody else, "Gravy, a man could get killed out there." By the time he got that pleasantry all decoded, Lou found he was more than able to shrug it off. And so I think I kind of generally get the gist of the quote, but I really couldn't put it into words. Do any of you understand what that quote is saying? What is?
I felt like you with this section. Like I literally wrote meaning off in the side margin on it. I stared at it for a long time trying to figure out really exactly what's going on that Lou was able to decode, but I don't know. I kind of get the general idea of like, yeah, it's a dangerous job that they have, but that is a really weirdly specific remark to make to have that loose of a meaning. So I really don't know.
Yeah, I honestly struggle with that one as well. Unless it's trying to remark on like the fact that he not only has had sort of a transformation from a mental or emotional perspective, but also from a physical perspective, where now like when he walks into a room, he embodies the organization that he comes from, and so suddenly people become afraid or react differently to him when they do notice him, and say something
Yeah.
like, "We could get killed out here," and run away. It's a similar sort of negative reaction that he used to get, but now he can sort of shrug it off because it's less of a thing.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I guess for me, I'm really puzzled by the internal logic of what Lou the character is taking it to be as a pleasantry, right?
Well, if the pleasantries that he used to receive are jeers and screaming, then maybe he. I don't know. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so is it like a warning for him? Is it a warning against him to others? Because it's ostensibly for other people, but it's being said when he enters rooms. And it sounds like, oh my God, wow, the weather out there is crazy because it's Chicago.
Mhm.
You could get killed out there. Is it a threat? I don't know.
Maybe he's wearing a badge and they're responding to a badge. I don't know.
If anybody listening has any thoughts on it, let us know.
Absolutely. So chapter 6 opens with Lou working at White City Investigations now, and Nate shows up one day and drops down a folder that has a royal crest on it featuring a two-headed eagle, which happens to be the crest of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the whole sort of depiction of Franz Ferdinand in this chapter is really
It's
quite
so good.
something. He's basically a child
Yep.
that has access to a lot of money and resources, and just sort of is out to cause mischief. We learn that that the Archduke is in town for the World's Fair, and that he needs some bodyguards. He has some of his own, but because of civil liability, the fair would like other people on it, or the city would like other people on it. We're not entirely sure who's tasked the WCI with handling this matter, but they've asked some local talent, so to speak, to take over as well. And so he decides to go down and, for some reason, assign Lou to this task. Seems like maybe it would have been a better idea to go with a better detective agent. But there's also another line in here about a warm invitation to rewrite history. This is, of course, This is, of course, kind of ironic. Like, obviously, it would make sense to say in context from the perspective of, like, we don't want history to get rewritten and that he died, but the fact that it's being specifically stated as being rewritten states some sort of, like, understanding that he is supposed to die, like, 20 years from now, not right now. Ironically, it was an anarchist who killed him.
Yep.
To go back into kind of the other themes of the book, a member of the Black Hand, which was a self-styled anarchist organization, was the one responsible for assassinating him in 1914. That can't happen yet. We gotta give him some time to get there.
Predestination.
Yeah, exactly. And so, FF, as he's termed in the dossier, is there to foreign peoples, and he has spent a lot of time at Buffalo Bill's Wild West show with, as it says, a certain amount of impatience, and then also went to the Colorado Silver Camp, where he learned about presumably gold and silver mining, and it describes a couple of other different things that he has done here as well that are quite comedic. But what he says he's really in Chicago for is something new and interesting to kill. And this follows a very interesting conversation where he describes the fact that Hungarians are the lowest people in all of Europe, which evidently is essentially the mindset of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when it existed, and certainly of this particular leader of that empire. He also mentions that where he normally resides, they go onto forest preserves where people scare animals towards what seems to be just a line of people with guns to shoot them down, and they
Yeah,
call that hunting.
Rich people hunting. That's exactly
Yeah,
what that
which
is.
so stupid. And then he does seem to indicate that he maybe has a desire to hunt Hungarians themselves. That he would like to go down to, like, the meatpacking district where a lot of them are purported to be sort of working, and just hunt them down. So not only is he, like, sort of moronic and childish, but he's also insane.
Yeah.
Which is quite crazy. And he eventually responds all this with, "Your Royal Highness, I'll sure ask about that, and somebody will get back to you as far as his request to go hunt Hungarians in a factory." To
That's
which
about the only thing you can say in that situation.
yeah, there's really nothing good that you can come up with
Yeah.
there. To which he says, Nate Privet thought this was just a knee slapper. Gonna be emperor one of these days. Can you beat that? And then there is another line in here about the fact that aren't there ain't enough Hungarians back home to keep him busy. There's a large Jewish contingent of Hungarians, and so when eventually he was assassinated, and that leads to World War One, and then obviously World War One leads to World War Two. There was plenty of Hungarians to keep Hitler and that regime busy from a perspective of, like, trying to in their words cleanse that country or deport or kill a lot of the Hungarian people. There's a lot of sort of intertwining of history between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then eventually the Weimar Republic and then Nazi Germany and all of that you can read about. So this is also another one of those cases of kind of, like, foreshadowing language. The undertaking of the deportation of the Hungarian Jews was a major event in Nazi Germany, and sort of that particular phase of the Holocaust is something that you can read a lot about. And it started to happen pretty late in the war as well. And then there's a reference also in here about being with more than damned anarchistic foreign-born South 47th than you could point a Mannlicher at, chuckled Nate. Sure, there'd be a few less of them to worry about, wouldn't it? A Mannlicher rifle was also the weapon used to kill JFK, or at least was presumed to be the one that was used to kill JFK at the beginning of that investigation. It is also referenced in Bleeding Edge that people like, oh god, who's the waspy guy that she goes and talks to midway through that book? But she says that people like that are real Mannlicher Carcano types.
Yeah.
So again, more references to sort of political assassination coming up in this section, and sort of like future world events that haven't exactly yet happened.
Well, just to tie all of this back into your earlier contextualization of the modest rebellion, the Hungarian Jewish population is absolutely what he's talking about. But the background of all that is that Hungarian as a term refers to two distinct populations, right? It refers to people living in what we call Hungary, and it It also refers specifically to Magyar people who were an invading force from the steppes of Asia in like the deep medieval period. And so you have this like recapitulation of caste as fluid, but also trees utterly set in stone. These, incoming invaders who took over what we now style Hungary today and suppressed all of the local population, the Slavic peoples, are now being hunted by this Austrian Habsburg prince.
We're introduced as well to Max Couch, who is the commissioned captain of the security that is traveling around with Franz Ferdinand, the K&K Special Security, which stands for Kaiserlich und Königlich, which is in German for imperial and royal. And they find some sort of common ground in both doing kind of the same job as one another. And through their conversations, there gets to be a invented German portmanteau in this paragraph that, again, if you go to the Pinch-On wiki, oh boy, is there a lot of detail about this particular word. It sort of means pastry depravity, but if you really like go through a lot of different layers of translating software, it actually kind of ends up meaning a shameful addiction to cookie dough, which in context of the detectives doing their job is a joke about cops really liking donuts, stereotypically. But I just think the idea of a pastry depravity is very funny.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it's very obvious that that Lou has no idea what he means, so he just says, well, we try not to talk about that.
But in Austria, it's widely remarked upon.
Apparently, they're all talking about the pastry depravity of the American police officer. Eventually, one of these nights, Franz Ferdinand has disappeared. And so Max goes over to the WCI and asks if Lou can find him. Lou goes through a series of bars and seedy dive places all around the city. Can't find him until eventually he goes down to the south side of the city, where he goes to a place called the Boll Weevil Lounge. It's on South State in the 30s, the heart of the vaudeville and black entertainment district in those days. Hollering his way into an evening which promised at least a troublesome moment or two. Barrelhouse piano, green beer, a couple of pool tables, girls in rooms upstairs, smoke from 2 for a penny cigars. Squalid! Screamed the Archduke. I love it! Lou kind of enjoyed it himself in this part of town, unlike some of the ops at White City who seemed skittish around Negroes, who'd been arriving lately in ever-increasing numbers from down south. Something about the neighborhood drew him. Maybe the food, surely the only place in Chicago a man could find a decent orange phosphate, although right at the moment you could not call the atmosphere welcoming. And then we are treated to truly a funny series of mixed German and English jokes that he is telling. But you can also tell that the atmosphere in the Boll Weevil Lounge is not a positive one as a result of this strange foreign emperor wandering in and drunkenly telling yo mama jokes.
Probably garishly dressed also. He's probably super fancy.
Yeah, he's probably got his whole sort of imperial regalia on. And I would love to know why Pinch-On loves Yo Mama jokes.
Who doesn't?
Just so much. Well, yes, I think most people do, but it tends to be something you stop doing in like in the 8th grade.
Right. But I think that's part of it. It's that highbrow lowbrow thing, because it's in all honesty, the Yo Mama joke is maybe one of the basest forms of humor. And I'm saying this as an ardent defender of the art form. It's great. I mean, when the Far Side can make a whole song about it, you've got something good there. But when he can present these kind of like really basement level jokes in a very sort of overwritten manner because of who's saying them, it just makes it's kind of to trace it back to The Simpsons again. It's kind of like the scene where Sideshow Bob keeps stepping on rakes. At a certain point, it stops being funny, and then it starts being funny again. it's the Yo Mama joke isn't always funny, but when you do it the right way, it starts being funny again. And I think that's what he's doing here is he's kind of just reinventing it in a really over the top fashion that just makes it so much better than it would have been.
Yeah, it is a truly funny part of this scene. I'll read it out here. What are you here to looking at? You wish to steal eine Wassermelon, perhaps? Ooh, went several folks in earshot. The insultee, a large and dangerous-looking individual, could not believe he was hearing. His mouth began to open slowly as the Austrian prince continued. Something about your Dynamoti, as you would say, your mama. She plays third base for the Chicago White Stocking, nicht wahr? As customers began tentatively to move towards the egresses, a quite unappealing woman. Indeed, she is so fat that to get from her tits to her ass, one has to take the L. Tried once to get into the exposition. They say, no, lady, this is the World's Fair, not the World's Ugly. It's just so... it's just so ridiculous. To imagine this man, again, like you said, dressed very garishly, drunk out of his mind, just...
The leader of a country.
Yeah, just insulting what seems to be depicted as a very large, physically imposing person.
Yeah,
like it's truly absurd, and is one of those things that only Pynchon can really come up with. And then Lou introduces himself and is like, "Hey, we gotta get out of here." And then he says, "It's all right. I know how to talk to these people. I have studied their culture. Listen, sos los Hund, boogie boogie, yeah." Which basically just mean, "What's up, dog?"
Just digging the grave deeper.
It actually literally means "What's up, dog?"
Yeah, like just "S up, dog" is what that translates to, which is so good.
I've got a bit of a galaxy brain interpretation of this.
Yeah,
where I mean, and I don't think it's that deep, but it is just stupid. That like he's literally walking into a bar full of people. Clearly, this is their like local bar. He's walking in. He opens with a racist joke that can be nothing except for racist. Like there is no interpretation of that other than, "Hey, you're black. You're stealing a watermelon, aren't you?" And immediately jumps into like, "Oh no, I speak their language."
Yeah.
Splos Hunde. Like it is just truly like the most epitomized form of like the way that central and all of European and white powers of the world at the time decided like, yeah, we're going to Africa. We now own this land. We're here. What do you have to say about it? Oh no, we're on your side. We're defending you. When no, you're not speaking their language. You're literally not speaking their language. You're literally just insulting them, and the only reason they're laughing is because they think they might get a free drink out of it.
Yeah, that's actually that's a very solid interpretation from perspective of like how he would end up that way. I definitely see it. We then see him diffuse the situation by saying, "When Franz Ferdinand drinks, everybody drinks." So then suddenly they all rejoice that they're going to get some free booze. Lou manages to drag him out to the exit, and then just as he's leaving, he says, "And when Franz Ferdinand pays, everyone pays," which then seems to erupt the club into a very violent altercation that they just barely escape. And then I love the description of them as they're leaving, where it says the Archduke, pouting like a child whose mischief has been interrupted, did not offer comment. Just literally acting like a child.
Well, yeah, and he's got the demonic grin when he says, "When Franz Ferdinand pays, everybody."
and saying a joke about yourself in the third person is already a crazy thing to do.
Oh yeah.
In many, like, I just watched the Royal Tenenbaums last night, and the way that Ben Stiller's character like holds himself physically like a child and acts like a child for most of that movie is just exactly what I like transposed onto this depiction of Franz Ferdinand.
Absolutely.
I just do love the juxtaposition of Franz Ferdinand assuming this kind of familiarity with all of these random people who he's really just there because he thinks of them as people who he, if he wanted, could just slaughter for the fun of it.
Yeah.
And juxtaposed right against Max Couch, literally like making a personal connection with Lou Bosnight as just like, hey, ring me up when you're in Vienna.
Yeah. Two people who have like an actual sort of experiential similarity.
Yeah.
It's a great sort of aside for this chapter. And it says Lou was just headed up to Kinsley's for a late steak when Nate called him into the office, reaching to fetch down a new folder. Old FF will be out of town in just a couple more days, Lou, but meantime, here's something for you tonight. Kinsley's was a restaurant in Chicago. It is not anymore. Pinch on Wiki says that it still is at 105 to 107 Adams Street in downtown Chicago. That's a hotel, but Kinsley's is as a famous steakhouse is not there. What we then learn is the new assignment given to him is to go check out a church. And it's not just any kind of church, it's a church where there is a meeting of some anarchists going on. Although, of course, these aren't anarchists as we would understand them now. It's just people who are interested in labor unions and in unionizing for a better workforce. There's a anarchist preacher named Reverend Moss Gatlin. He is not a real character, but it is very obvious that he is based on a very real tradition of anarchist preachers. There was even a preacher who was going to be present at the Haymarket situation that was covered in the earlier chapters we went through, but didn't end up being there, and then was going to do a meeting in commemoration of the Haymarket attack, but then Philadelphia authorities suppressed his arrival. So there is a very long history that is very real of this kind of sort of self-styled anarchist preachers being a thing. We do also get some stuff like from the jungle that Luke had mentioned in this section when they describe kind of the amassed people that are there. There's a description of them as being unbathed, exhausted, flatulent, sullen, and then women in surprising numbers bearing the marks of their trades, scars from the blades of the meatpacking floors, squints from needlework carried past the borderlands of sleep and caucus bad light, women in headscarves, crocheted fascinators, extravagantly flowered hats or no hats at all. Or women just looking to put their feet up after too many hours, lifting, fetching, working the jobless avenues, bearing the insults of the day. And then there's a reference to the fact that sort of after whatever homily or sermon or whatever is given, that they sing out of the Workers' Own Songbook. This is probably based off of the Little Red Songbook that the IWW used and still uses. And I, as far as I can tell, this particular song they sing is not from the IWW songbook or is not inspired by it, but the idea of there being sort of trade union songs is a very real thing and has a very long history associated with it. Do we have any thoughts on the song that they do sing that Lou sort of witnesses?
I think it might be among his best.
I love the way that it continues the conflation of the North and the Fold and all of those other symbols that are going to get even more and more textually relevant as we go through the book. And on top of that, like this is funny. I don't know if I can do much of it, but the name of the Reverend is Moss Gatlin. Gatlin gun. Kind of obviously, I don't know if there's any other signifier that Gatlin as name's associated with. But then Moss is also, while it has the, the hometown vibe of the name, but it also, it's a lot like Mossberg. And so you have, this guy with endless riches walking around shooting women in the street with what is treated as just another cane. You have the anarchist reverend who's singing a song about solidarity and about, all of these virtues that pretty much everyone agrees on being positive, but in the service of revolution in the long term. He's named for guns.
That's a good thought. I hadn't thought of it.
Yeah, I hadn't either.
So from there, we get a very striking description of Lou kind of understanding that like this is not that crazy. like
they might be onto something here.
Like these guys might have a point, and perhaps like the stuff that Will just said that everyone would kind of largely agree is a good thing is probably a good thing. And maybe I'm on the wrong side of things. It's not explicitly stated, but you can tell that he's potentially having some changes of heart. So again, that streak that runs through him is kind of continuing to be prodded the longer he's spending at White City Investigations. And as soon as he leaves that sort of union meeting, he kind of has this realization that was meant to radicalize him against unions, and that his assignment wasn't anything more than just go there and bear witness to the savagery going on at the Union Hall. Was really what he was supposed to get out of that, be radicalized against it. And in actuality, it really did not accomplish that. It may have done the opposite. And at any rate, he understands that his assignment in that regard hasn't sort of ended, which he's proved right about. After he wraps up his time following the Austrian Archduke, he begins getting a lot of different work thrown on his desk regarding anarchists. And it says he found himself at factory fences, breathing coal smoke, walking picket lines in various of WCI's 1,000 disguises, learning enough of several Slavic tongues to be plausible down in the deadfalls where the desperate malcontents convene. Fingerless slaughterhouse veterans, irregulars in the army of sorrow, prophesizers who had seen America as it might be in visions America's wardens could not tolerate. So again, there's some more sort of allusions to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle there, but then also this idea that, they're preaching a vision of America that, as he puts there, the wardens of America cannot tolerate. These people like sort of Scarsdale vibe. These are the wardens that they're talking about. And it goes on to say that White City continued to take a bigger share of this work, dealing with the anarchists and the union people. So much so that the Pinkertons started to get kind of disgruntled about it, and got even more disgruntled about the fact that people like Scarsdale Vibe were suddenly showing up at the WCI office asking for advice and asking for how to sort of infiltrate or handle, potentially unionization efforts at their own factory. And then what the Pinkertons started to do was sort of buy out all of their detectives and just sort of throw enough money at it until finally they could absorb most of the office, until it kind of seems like it's just
Lou,
and Lou and Nate working in the office is how it seems there. And so Nate decides to offer him the opportunity to go get a what does he call it? A regional director reassignment to go run a new office they're going to establish in Denver. And through this conversation, you realize that it's just because there's no one else to go do that. It's just the two of them.
It's really ironic that in the end, both White City Investigations and the Pinkertons, their whole goal here is to eliminate or eradicate the threat of anarchism and to uphold the sanctity, I guess, if you will, of capitalism. Ends up being what undoes them. They get destroyed by the very thing that they're trying to prop up and help maintain, when they don't have the same kind of buying power that the Pinkertons have.
Yeah, absolutely true. And then we get a very nice description. Does anyone want to read that quote? Ever come out of work in this town?
Oh yeah, I love that part. I have it right here. Ever come out of work in this town when the light's still in the sky and the lamps are just being lit along the big avenues and down by the lake, and the girls are all out of the office shops and heading home? Steakhouses are cranking up for the evening trade, and the plate glass windows are shining with the rigs all lined up by the hotels. And no, Nate's staring impatiently. Not too often. I work too late for that. Lou blew a smoke ring and a few more concentrically. Well, now shit there, Nate.
I love that quote because it shows the benefit of his kind of enlightened position. This idea of it is what it is. Everything is what it is. Mm-hmm. And his ability to kind of notice these things has led him to kind of seemingly fall in love with his surroundings as far as where he lives. So he doesn't want to be reassigned, but he also feels as though he has no choice, which is why when his next assignment comes up, being his time aboard the Inconvenience, it says that he feels uncomfortable telling the Chums of Chance about his transfer. In the short time he'd been riding with them, he'd almost come to feel more at home up in the Inconvenience than he did at the agency. And so he does his sort of observations that he needs to do. And then there is a reference here to Freddie Turner. Luke, I know you said you wanted to speak on the Freddie Turner reference.
I talked in the first episode about how I took that class on this, took a few classes on this time period, and one of those classes was about the American South and the Reconstruction era, and that class was taught by a history professor who specialized in historiography, which is the study of how history is written. Frederick Jackson Turner was, probably the biggest name in the writing of history during the post Civil War period into the Gilded Age. And yeah, I mean, his writing was mostly about, I think, the American West and the kind of the manifest destiny type thing, where he talked a lot about how the frontier kept moving west and west and west, but the existence of the frontier is kind of what drove America's, I mean, obviously America's growth, but America's growth like economically, and like it provided a place for America to expand into, that Europe had no Europe people in Europe and people in other places in the world didn't have the same opportunity, the same frontier kind of pushing them forward and pushing them forward. And that whole concept of the frontier kind of helped drive American exceptionalism and turn America into the country that we know it as today. This is a bit more off topic and a bit of an aside, but the point of that class, largely the point of that class, was that and it was obviously taught by a Southerner. I think he's from Arkansas, but his whole point was that although the South lost the Civil War, it was largely Southern historians who wrote the history of the Civil War. But the large part of that class was him trying to kind of point out that because Southerners were so influential in writing the history of that time period, that they ended up kind of like culturally winning the Civil War after it was over, even if they lost the actual physical battle, the actual physical war, it was a very interesting class. A different class I took was the Gilded Age, and like around that time, the late 1800s, like just like and I guess we still have people go on speaking tours today, but it was a lot bigger of a deal if you're living in a town, a mid-sized town, a smaller town, and a speaker came through. It'd be kind of more of a social event like concerts or movies are today, or something like that, where there seemed to be a lot more like kind of general interest from the average person in more intellectual ideas and more like in and intellectually stimulating themselves. And yeah, Turner was just a pretty big deal back then in a way that I think he did do speaking tours as well. And I think Turner was a big deal back then in a way that no historians really are today.
Yeah, certainly not in the sense that there's like a big name historian that like everybody knows about now, that like people go see talk. I guess maybe like Harari, but he's not really much of a historian. He's more of like a sociologist as far as the stuff that he writes. So I think you're definitely right about that. In context of sort of the story that's being told, they're really making a lot of reference to his work, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, which after I've kind of read this section of the book, I kind of want to go read that book, even though it's probably pretty dry.
Oh, I imagine it is.
Considering that Freddie Turner lived between 1861 and 1932. But they're essentially talking about how, as Lou's about to head out west to Denver, he's going to find that sort of the American West now is not the same as it used to be. And Professor Vandrew says, it may not be quite the West you're expecting. Back in July, my colleague Freddie Turner came out here from Harvard and gave a speech before a bunch of anthro people who were all in town for their convention, and of course the fair. To the effect that the western frontier we all thought we knew from song and story was no longer on the map, but gone, absorbed, a dead duck. To show you what he means, said Randolph, putting the helm over and causing the inconvenience to veer inland, bearing northwest towards the Union Stock Yards. And really, I think that, I would imagine that what Freddie Turner is getting at in that book, and also what is about to be kind of talked about in the story, is that, like, the kind of essence of American culture, if there is a distinctly American culture, because unlike a lot of other countries, we have no, like, unified cultural identity, in the same way that, a place like Germany, or a place like England, or a place like France, or whatever has. If there's anything sort of distinctly American, it is that kind of mythologized idea of the West and the cowboy and the frontier and all of that. And even a lot of that is taken from, people in Mexico and sort of that southern culture around what is now the U.S.-Mexico border. But, when that eventually dies and is replaced by regular civilization that, Lou's about to go into, what is really left of that American identity, or that kind of connection between savagery and civilization, which is one of the sort of excerpts from The Significance of the Frontier in American History that the Pynchon Wiki pulls, where it says, in this advance, the frontier is the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. And if there's one thing that it would appear as though Pynchon advocates for, it is something like that meeting point between savagery and civilization, that you can keep the sort of savage Edenic landscape, but still do so in a civilized way. It's that sort of luditism idea of like, society's gone far enough. We don't need the automatic loom. And it is a good thing to fight against that actively. And or in Mason and Dixon, society's gone far enough. We don't need to carve up the lines. This is pointless. Or don't cross the warrior path, or whatever, interpretations or kind of pivot points you want to pull out of that book. The same thing I think would be true here with this sort of uniquely American identity. That at one point there was some of that meeting between the savage and the civilized that kind of epitomized what we should have kept. So he steers the anything that's over that stockyard, and we're treated to this great quote that starts. We'll read the whole thing in its entirety. We'll just take turns, because I feel like this is a particular section of this book that has a lot of significance to not only what the book is about, but Pynchon's canon as a whole. It starts, "Yes, here," continued the professor, nodding down at the yards as they began to flow by beneath. "Here's where the trail comes to its end at last, along with the American cowboy who used to live on it and by it. No matter how virtuous he's kept his name, how many evildoers he's managed to get by undamaged, how he's done by his horses, what girls he has chastely kissed, serenaded by guitar, or gone out and raised hallelujah with, it's all back there in the trail dust now, and none of it matters. For down there you'll find the wet convergence in the finale of his drought-struck tale and thankless calling. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show stood on its head, spectators invisible and silent. Nothing to be commemorated, the only weapons in view being blitz instruments and whack-it punches to knock the animals out. Along with the blades, everybody's packing, of course, and the rodeo clowns jabber on in some incomprehensible lingo, not to distract the beast, but rather to heighten and maintain its attention to the single task at hand, bringing it down to those last few gates, the stunning devices waiting inside, butchering and blood just beyond the last chute, and the cowboy with him. Here." He handed Lou a pair of field glasses. "That little charabanc down there, just making the turn off 47.
As the airship descended closer, Lou watched the open vehicle pull up inside the Halstead Street gate to discharge its passengers, and understood with some perplexity that it was an excursion group in town for a tour among the killing floors and sausage rooms. An instructive hour of throat-slashing, decapitation, skinning, gutting, and dismemberment. "Say, Mother, come have a look at these poor bastards," following the stock in their somber passage from arrival in rail cars into the smells of shit and chemicals, old fat and tissue, diseased, dying, and dead, and a rising background choir of animal terror and shouting in human languages few of them had heard before, till the moving chain brought in stately parade the hook-hung carcasses at last to the chilling rooms. At the exit, the visitors would find a souvenir shop where they could purchase stereopticon slides, picture postcards, and cans of top gourmet grade souvenir luncheon meat, known to include fingers and other body parts from incautious work.
Don't think I'll give up steaks just yet, Lou said, but it does make a man wonder how disconnected those folks down there have to be. That's about it, the professor nodded. The frontier ends and disconnection begins. Cause and effect? How the dickens do I know? I spent my earlier hob-raising years out where you're headed, Denver and Cripple Creek and Colorado Springs. While there was still a frontier, you always knew where it was and how to get there. And it wasn't always between natives and strangers, or Anglos and Mexicans, or cavalry and Indians. You could feel it unmistakably, like a divide where you knew you could stand and piss would flow two ways at once.
But if the frontier was gone now, did that mean Lou was about to be disconnected too from himself, sent off into exile, into some silence beyond silence as retribution for a remote and ancient vice, always just about to be remembered? half stunned in a half dream, like a surgeon's knot taken swiftly in the tissue of time and pulled snug, delivered into the control of potent operatives who did not wish him well.
Yeah, I mean that's a striking passage for a number of reasons, and I'm sure we all have thoughts. So,
Yeah.
what do we think about this this section?
I posted a picture of this page in the preceding page on Twitter and Blue Sky earlier today, just showing like I noted the hell out of this whole section. Like it, I think you can really distill Pynchon's work in general into this section.
Agreed.
So much of what he has been talking about, from everything he wrote before this book and everything after this book, is here. The idea of entropy, the movement of the free range cattle and corralling them and packing them into as little space as possible until they're moving in a singular line of extremely low entropy. Capitalism destroying the last vestiges of what would be true independence in the US by taking control of the land and subjugating the people that owned that land, whether it was the native inhabitants or the people who got the land when the settlers came over. Once the corporations started buying all that out and using the land for their own purposes, and then taking the land and just reselling it to other people and just making money off of the money they're making from that. That line about the rodeo clowns jabber on in some incomprehensible lingo, not to distract the beast, but rather to heighten and maintain its attention to the single task at hand. That's television. You know, where it's just there to make sure that we are, you know, staying in the line and moving towards the singular goal that we're meant to be moved towards. The way that the working class or the immigrants that are coming in to work in these factories are just being watched by rich people and you know, for entertainment almost. This, you know, the kid talking about, look at these poor bastards. It's a novelty to them. You know, this idea of this lower class, these blue collar people that are doing what they have to do to barely even eke out a living, if they're even doing that. And they're, you know, that's just fodder for these super wealthy people to come in and just have a chuckle at before they go to the souvenir shop and buy some piece of shit that they're not going to remember when they go home.
Yeah.
All of the consumerization of the world that has happened in the time since, if you want to track it back far enough to Mason and Dixon, that's really essentially the sort of foot coming down on the land to start that process. This is the culmination of everything that he's done thematically in pretty much all of his work. And to distill that and put it into, essentially, if you really want to make it, you know, a full page and a half maybe, is insanely impressive. And it is so beautifully written and so perfectly encapsulated. It might be my favorite section of any of his work.
Yeah, I think that you absolutely nailed it. I mean, just I don't know if there's really anything additional that I can add to what you had already mentioned there, but it is exactly, I think, that distillation of just what happens when sort of the counterforces or the powers that be or the capital P they, whatever you want to call them, slowly kind of grind away at creating this version of modernity that is cruel and unfair and ultimately just based around capitalism, just based around a making of money, to the point where not only have they already killed kind of the American dream, so to speak, from that perspective of the mythological Western or cowboy, or that mixture of the savage and the modern, which of course also maps cleanly to a mixture of high and low puns, you know, to kill that, and then also to make the replacement that is cheap and gross and leads to the destruction of people's lives physically, or, you know, loss of limbs or appendages as a tourist attraction in of itself. It's a perfect sort of encapsulation of all that. And yet still, you still have this character at the end, Lou, saying, I don't think I'll give up stakes just yet. Almost sort of as this, like, you know, yeah, it's bad, but it could be better. Like, if we keep working to make things better, maybe there's a way to push back on that. Which, again, if you're going to go for Lou as the Pynchon stand-in, that makes a lot of sense, because that, if anything else, is what Pynchon's been trying to do by publishing these books. Like, if this either radicalizes the readers or if this helps them understand the historical context of how these things happen, or to do these little things every day to help kind of push back against the dark, so to speak, then it's worth it, and it's worth trying to do that. Which again, I realize I probably referenced that end section of Vineland more than anything else, but I think it is sort of a Rosetta Stone for a lot of the stuff that he wrote post that, and just in general of this cosmic sort of balance of like one person puts their thumb on the scale and they have a big effect on it, but other people trying as hard as they can to kind of lift the scale back up do eventually equalize it.
Yeah, and the only addition I would have to discussion of this is that the one major element of this book, but also all of Pynchon's novels that is missing from this section is the discussion of A, the theoretical, and B, the spiritual. You're lacking the mathematics. Like, sure, it's there in a thematic sense with the entropy being collapsed, but that is mostly being us reading it, having read the earlier scenes with a similar dynamic happening. We're reading that into it. But what this section is, this incredibly demotivating section of the chapter in the book, is just the material discussion. It is almost like an encapsulation of the world as is, rather than a discussion of the world as is felt, or the world that as is as hypothetical, which are all things which have double edges. That they cut both ways. They're both dangerous and they are hopeful. It is that Lou Bosnight saying, well, hey, I'm not done eating meat yet, but how disconnected do you have to be? It is that impulse of, yeah, but what if we did things differently? It is that, well, sure, that's the state of the world, but what if it were not? That is that hopeful thing, which I think is kind of encapsulated in a lot of our conversations about the end of Bleeding Edge. It is that hope is dangerous. Hope can lead people to create horrific narratives that justify even worse things, but it can also lead people to create books like this, which is not much compared to the evils of colonialism and exploitation, but it's something. And that's kind of that whole dichotomy, right? Within this book, it is that there's that imaginary component that we can't pin down.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Sort of, it's covering more of the physical and not so much the metaphysical that also comes up in his work.
Yeah, I bring it up because that's the thing, is that I think a lot of the time it's easy to leave it at the description. But what I think is so important about Thomas Pynchon's books, and the reason that I stayed home from a basketball game to record this goddamn podcast, is because it has that hope in it, and it acknowledges both the need for it and the primacy of it in terms of not having the end of history mean the end of humanity or the end of meaning.
Well, from there, we learn that's sort of the end of Lou's time with the Chums Chance. They give him a golden enamel honorary membership pin to be worn beneath his lapel, which upon being revealed in any branch, any place in the world, would entitle him to all visitors' privileges provided for in the CFC Charter. Lou, in return, would give them a miniature spotter's telescope disguised as a watch fob, also holding a single 22 round, which it was able to fire in an emergency.
That was such a thing at this time, was the thing that not, it's a gun, but it's also this, but it's a gun. What a uniquely turn of the century of the thing that they had going at the time.
My favorite of those was probably a desk that was also a gun.
Right.
It's also always single shotguns too.
Always,
there's no 2-3 round.
You
magazine.
better be incredibly accurate or very fast.
Yeah. The presence of the turn of the century gun, though, causes quite a bit of a consternation among the members of the staff of the Inconvenience, though, as as they say, it has the opportunity to invite a mutiny aboard, and they ultimately decide that it's probably best if they just probably get rid of it, because in some cases between missions, people just fucking commit suicide, which
Just casually.
which
Yeah.
begins this sort of transitory point where now that kind of this boy's adventure story is done, we get this kind of depressing, episode where they don't have a purpose anymore. So
Yeah.
we've so far lived through a Chums of Chance novel. It's apparently 54 pages, which sounds probably about right for an old dime store kind of paperback. And now they're waiting for whatever the next one is. And apparently in those periods of waiting, it is so bad that sometimes they literally commit suicide by just jumping off the edge of their airship, which is really the point of that transition.
It's almost hinted at a little bit earlier when on page 52 it says Randolph had a sympathetic look. At least they tell you where it is you'll be sent off to. After the closing day ceremonies here, our future's all a blank. Just really sad.
That's true.
It really, like I mentioned earlier, I kind of made the joke about them being NPCs and just kind of the programming's gone for a little while until the main character comes back in and gives them a purpose. It really it's something that you never think about with those kind of stories. There's always the adventure, there's the next chapter of their journey, but what goes on in between those times, It can't all be the high flying, high fun, high octane action. There's got to be the downtime, and that downtime is apparently existentially just dreadful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do enjoy the fact that it's described as them being held there as under some uncodified spell.
Mm-hmm. The good food goes away, the bad food comes out. The
Yeah.
setting just gets grimy. Yeah, it's a real turn.
I don't know, a lamb sandwich doesn't sound that bad to me.
Well, when it's heavy on the fat and gristle, that's not great.
Perhaps, yeah.
That's a chewy sandwich.
Yeah, a shaken spoon that smacked the flour-heavy gravy on. Flour-heavy gravy sounds disgusting.
Yeah,
Really
that's
toothsome gravy.
Less tangy mayonnaise at that point.
Eventually, after dining on several of these horrible, quote, wet and dry sandwiches and drinking their terrible wine, they eventually wake up one morning to see that there is a note wedged between two strands of cable, as always unconnected by any action they might have been contemplating. Orders silently delivered in the night. Bear east is pretty much all it says. Randolph in quiet consternation, east by south. Lindsay pulled out charts. Speculation began to fill the day. Once it had been enough to know the winds and how they blew at each season of the year to get a rough idea of where they might be headed. Presently, as the inconvenience began to acquire its own sources of internal power, there would be other global streamings taken into account. Electromagnetic lines, of course, aether storm warnings, movements of population capital, not ballooning profession as the boys learned. And so they eventually decide to head out on their next adventure. Any thoughts remaining on chapter 6?
Well, to roll back my deconstruction of the Chums of Chance as provisional characters, they are characters. They are, if you're gonna read the book and enjoy it, you're gonna have to attribute an internal being to them. And so it's not just like, oh, they are in a stasis moment, and so there's nothing to propel them forward, and so they are just kind of on autopilot. It is also the fact that, like, in real life, in the real world with real people, like a lot of the reasons that people resort to what could be phrased in the least compassionate but also kind of at its heart true way by a a Protestant preacher. They're harming themselves by eating these bad foods, and they're drinking this cheap wine, and they're abusing themselves. There's an earlier mention of like, oh, you eat so much alligator alutufe, the inconvenience can no longer take off. They are in some way like the suicidality of being on the airship with nothing to do is like a real thing that happens in naval life. Sailors just jumped off ships all the time in the days before, the printing press, and in the days before there were entertainments to be had on board beyond gambling. And so it's very much a real human moment of like, well, their time here has come to an end. They're no longer, sure, they made a friend and the friend that they had left, and that's sad, but that's not the issue. The issue is they've lost their motivation. They don't have a reason to be there anymore, and they don't have a next thing to do. So what are they going to do except for eat things that are immediately satisfying and drink cheap wine because, hey, they can afford it. And, sure, they're supposed to be sober, but they're not on duty right now. When you lose that driving force, you lose reason to care for yourself. You lose reason to not want to roll off the side of the ship. It's a deeply compassionate scene, and there's only more of them to come.
Yeah.
And I do love the way that, like, I can say completely seriously at the beginning of this section, they're provisional people. They don't exist. They're just words on the page. But then Pynchon can make my heart hurt for them because they don't have anything to do. They're overgrown kids with too much responsibility who are having to keep themselves from situating their actions within the world, and all they can do is distract themselves.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
if nothing else, to underscore the point of distracting oneself, the final quotes about the White City being vacuumed out of all of its purpose, and then squatters rushing in to set up camp in there is also just as affecting. The idea that this like perfect depiction of capitalism and the coming world and all of that is wrapped up after a few months, and then all of a sudden the reality of the downtrodden underclass and all of the people who helped build it but have no longer received employment from it are now just squatting there. And if I'm not mistaken, that was a real thing, and they had to it was a whole deal to like get all of the people squatting in the White City out because they had to demolish it. And just to underscore that same idea with how the Chums are feeling before they get those orders, I think it's a good, again, another good set of two things being compared and contrasted.
Mhm.
The Chums of Chance set off, and that place is worse now that they're gone. Any other thoughts on chapter 6?
I guess my last thought is that I think that the idea at this point it's permeated pop culture, the idea that to discuss someone killing themselves is to lead others to do so. And I don't think I've seen a more competent and elegantly phrased depiction of that other than these boy adventurers getting a gun on board and like suddenly realizing, oh, we could just kill ourselves. We don't have to do any of this.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's that simple sometimes. It's not like it justifies the killing of yourself, but it doesn't need to. It's an option. And if you have that option and you're reminded of it, why not, right?
Especially if you're bored enough.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder how many mutinies occurred out of boredom.
Right.
I need something to do. Let's overthrow the captain.
Bored, guys. Let's take this thing over. Hell yeah.
Well, and I think that might be to some extent the larger political assertion of what Pynchon's getting at there, right?
Mhm.
If you can wrest control of the ship that you're aboard away from the captain, you don't need to kill him. You don't need to exile him. If there are 4 or 5 crew members and they say, "Hey, now, Randolph, you're wrong. We need to do things differently," then they can. But if you can't, then all you can do is jump off the side or steer the ship into a rock.
Well, if there's no other thoughts, that brings us to the close of chapter 6. Are there any funny parts that we didn't go over?
I did like Sally's reaction to the Chums. It just says, this is on page 27. The child, meanwhile, having caught sight of the Chums in their summer uniforms, stood gazing, her eyes wide, as if deciding how well behaved she ought to be. Like just the knowing how garishly dressed they are, and this kid trying to like ascertain what that means as far as their behavior is concerned is very amusing. Like just watching the wheels turn in her head.
I really liked the little little cap on the scene on page 33, where Ray Ipso and Merle are getting to know each other a little better and talking about these big, scary political ideas. And Chevrolet is just tired of listening to this. And it's thematically relevant, but it's also just like, hey, can we shut up and dance or do something?
I know that we went over the Franz Ferdinand Your Mama jokes in pretty good depth, but I do want to make a note that the audiobook narrator for this book, at least on Audible, does a very good job with Franz Ferdinand's lines, and he inserts some of like his own laughter into it. You know, like it doesn't say that Franz Ferdinand laughed, or doesn't put ha ha ha, but he inserts that into it, and I found that very entertaining and pretty funny to listen to. The voice he does for Franz Ferdinand is pretty good. That, and I've been thinking about this for an hour or two now, kind of on and off. The whole like Lou's backstory with him having done something terrible and not knowing what it is, and having no idea what's going on, and like being confused about it. I know that that's pretty horrifying and it's absurd, but I do think you could like write a comedy, like a movie comedy or a comedic book or a story
It's
based
very
on
Charlie
that. You know?
Kaufman-esque, yeah.
Yeah, where like it's so absurd and it's so horrifying that there's an element of comedy almost there.
I can see Bob Balaban playing a character that's trying to figure out what the hell he did wrong, and no one will tell him.
Yeah.
Well, it's also, speaking of Kafka, like you brought up in the beginning, Luke, it's also possibly somewhat referential to the trial.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
It's very true. I didn't even think about that.
The character in the trial has no idea what he did wrong, and the entire time he's trying to figure it out.
Jesus, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
On top of that, the humor of all that. Have y'all heard the anecdote from, was it Max Ernst? Can't remember. Kafka's friend who published his works posthumously basically said, oh yeah, Kafka would just sit there and laugh his ass off writing these stories. And he just didn't understand why everybody thought they were so dark. And I'm sure there's a little bit of mythologization going on there, because there's no way you can't, if you've read the trial, the ending, there's no way you can step away from that and say, this is just a funny joke.
Oh, it's so good.
But it is funny. It is like,
yeah.
It is simultaneously deathly serious and deeply hilarious.
Does anyone in particular want to go first on quotes? I love your note here.
Why? Because I wrote too many in the notes?
Yeah, that was a great.
Yeah, and we read out so many good quotes while we were going over it. But mine is the final paragraph of the section, which we did kind of cover, but I might read all of it. It's not too long. So later, after closing day and autumn deepened over the corrupted prairie, as the ill-famed hawk, miles aloft, invisibly rehearsed its arctic repertoire of swift ascent, merciless assault, rapture of souls. The abandoned structures of the fair would come to house the jobless and hungry who had always been there, even at the height of the season of miracle just concluded. The Colorado Silver mining camp, like the other former exhibits, was occupied now by drifters, squatters, mothers with nursing infants, hellraisers hired for the run of the fair, now, their market value having vanished, returned to the constellation of drinks, dogs, and cats who preferred the company of their own species, some who still bore memories of Pugnax and his conversation, and excursions they had been out on, all moving in closer to the fires of fair debris, once the substance of wonder, as the temperature headed down.
That's great.
Yep.
Just so satisfying.
It really is. And now I'm looking for another one. Thank you.
Mine comes from page 38, where it says, Lou looked around. Was it still Chicago? As he began to walk, the first thing he noticed was how few of the streets here followed the familiar grid pattern across the town. Everything was on the skew, narrow lanes radiating starwise from small plazas. Tram lines with hairpin turns that carried passengers abruptly back the way they'd been coming. Increasing chance for traffic collision, and not a name he could recognize on any of the street signs, even those of the better traveled thoroughfare. Foreign languages, it seemed, not for the first time. He experienced a kind of waking swoon, which, not so much propelled, allowed him entry into an urban setting, like the world he had left, but differing in particulars which are not slow to reveal themselves. I picked that quote because that is kind of the joy of living in a city or being in a city, is that there are always different parts of it that you can find or come across that are, completely sort of strange or foreign to the rest of the city that maybe you've explored either on a previous visit or just in the time that you've lived there so far, and that there's so much opportunity for these different kind of multicultural corners to sort of come out and express themselves. And I was reminded of when I was in Berlin for quite a while in 2019, and I was being led around after a day of doing some labor at this apartment complex by one of the locals that I was with, and she led me and some other people down this like winding pathway of like alleyways and thoroughfares and different areas of the city until we were someplace that, like, if I went back to Berlin again, I could not tell you where it was. But she discovered, or rather brought us to a discovery she had at a different time, this tiny Asian restaurant that was like stuck basically in an alleyway. Like, it didn't have an entrance from the street. You had to go through this weird pathway of alleys to get to it. And we sat in the courtyard area, which of course is reminiscent of what he eventually ends up finding in that courtyard within a courtyard. And I had the greatest Chinese food I've ever had in my life, just sitting in this incomprehensible space, somewhere in East Berlin. And so that I got like a very strong sense memory of that from reading that quote out.
See, it's you in this discussion of the joys of living in a city that make me believe your what supposedly ironic comment on being a Pinkerton agent.
I will go with the description of the costumes available at White City Investigations. This is on page 43 going into 44, ending chapter 5. At White City Investigations, invisibility was a sacred condition. Whole darn floors of office buildings being given over to its art and science. Resources for disguise that outdid any theatrical dressing room west of the Hudson. Rows of commodes and mirrors extending into the distant shadows. Acres of costumes, forests of hat racks bearing an entire museum of hat history. Countless cabinets stuffed full of wigs, false beards, putty, powder, coal, and rouge, dyes for skins and hair, adjustable gaslight at each mirror that could be taken from a lawn party at a millionaire's cottage in Newport to a Badlands saloon at midnight with just a tweak to a valve or two. Lou enjoyed wandering around, trying on different rigs like every day was Halloween. But he understood after a while that he didn't have to. He had learned to step to the other side of the day. To the side of the day. Wherever it was he stepped had its own vast, incomprehensible history, its perils and ecstasies, its potential for unannounced romance and early funerals. But when he was there, it was apparently not as easy for anyone in Chicago to be that certain of his whereabouts. Not exactly invisibility, excursion. And I'll circle that back around to my idea of Pynchon. That very much just reads as a writer's love of writing, the ability to slip into any setting and persona and really just kind of explore what that does and where that takes you is such a rewarding concept. And to know the sort of vastness of one's imagination and how infinite that could be as far as the possibilities of what you can create is just such a cool thing to think about, and to apply it to a character like this in a situation like this, I think just really lends to this idea of, the Pynchon who just kind of always wanted to be a gumshoe in a dime store detective novel and see where that takes him. Now he gets to play with that character again, because it comes up again in Inherent Vice, and that's kind of what Maxine is in Bleeding Edge. It seems to be his kind of go-to favorite kind of character to play with.
Yeah, I very nearly chose that one. However, the one that I will go with is on we talked about it a bit on page 50 after the anarchist hymn. For something here was striking him as what you'd have to call odd. Nate Privet, everybody else at WCI, needless to say, most of the agency's clients, none had too good of a word to say about the labor unions, let alone anarchists of any stripe. That's if they even saw a difference. There was a kind of general assumption around the shop that laboring men and women were all more or less evil, surely misguided, and not quite American, maybe not quite human. But here was this hall full of Americans. No question, even the foreign-born, if you thought about where they'd come from and what they must have been hoping to find over here and so forth. American in their prayers, anyway. And maybe if you hadn't shaved for a while, but it was hard to see how any fit the bearded, wild-eyed, red description too close. In fact, give them a good night's sleep and a square meal or two. Even a veteran detective had have a hard time telling the difference from regular Americans. Yet here they were expressing the most subversive thoughts, as ordinary folks might discuss crops or last night's ball game. Lou understood that this business would not end with him walking out the door tonight and over to the L and on to some next assignment. I think we explored all of the stuff to talk about earlier, but it's just a beautifully composed paragraph.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. That's the perfect example of a quote that is really good, but is also, you don't have to read it out for the context of what the chapters is about. Do we have a most pinch on part of the chapter that stands out to anybody?
I mean, for me, it's the last part of chapter 6.
If only to be different, I would say it's the section with Franz Ferdinand.
That too. It's very good.
I think mine is probably the introduction of Lou's like detective abilities, or his ability to notice small details and stuff. And specifically, I mean, that's very Pinchonian, but specifically the fact that like that doesn't define him as a character, or that like everything that like every part that features him, it's not like him constantly doing that kind of stuff, where like a lot of other people would build a whole book out of those abilities, or have the character constantly be noticing stuff and it being like very Sherlock Holmesian, whereas it's just kind of another character trait for Lou, and I really like that. I think it's a very Pinchonian thing to do, to not focus on that as much.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, and also to just be different, I guess. I'll go with what the paragraph I dissected earlier, the introduction of Scarsdale vibe. It's such a dense symbolic paragraph that is so in line with a lot of his broad themes.
Yeah, that's very, very true. So that brings us to listener comments and questions. We had a lot of them, which is great. I figured the best way to tackle this is if we just wanted to kind of go round robin through all of them. Cody, if you want to start with the first one you have here.
Yeah, this is the one we were alluding to earlier that we got by email from Chris. Hey all, I just listened to my first ever episode of your podcast, which is very convenient for me as I'm a little of due against today. I was interested in your take on the Chums of Chance and the idea you had that Lindsay or Randolph being a young-looking 20 or 30-year-old. In my imagination, they were like 12 or 13 at the beginning. I wondered if the novel gives us any firm reason to know just how old they are. My view places the Chums of Chance more into the realm of fantasy, and yours is more realistic, questioning this is maybe a place Pynchon wants the reader to reside. I was prompted to ask by my just reading much further on that one of the many focus characters, whom I had assumed to be a 17 or so year old young woman, and past growing, had grown an inch over the past year. It really puts a new lens on the dangers Pynchon's world subjects her to. As the novel develops, a lot of characters are introduced at their birth, their transition from infancy to childhood to adulthood, and how they are when they take on mature responsibilities might be a really profitable thing to try to track for a more careful reader than I am. I guess the Chums aren't the only ones who are children acting in an adult world, but they're a lot more protected by living in a boy adventure novel. Most of these other children in Against the Day have no such protection. Thanks for your podcast. Look forward to continuing. Firstly, thank you, Chris. That was a very, very well thought out discussion point, and one that I responded to by email, just letting him know we'll talk about this on the show because there's a lot to unpack, and I don't want to just speak for every one of us in a simple kind of email response. I think it's interesting with the Chums as far as the age, because it's not really ever clearly stated how old they are, but they certainly are younger than I think a lot of first time readers might think. I don't know that I would put them at like 13, 14, but maybe 15, 16 with some of them maybe a little bit older, but still too young to really be doing maybe some of the things that they are doing and to have some of the experiences that they're having without having some kind of detrimental impact on them. But such is the life of boy adventurers, and again, to refer back to the Venture Brothers, it doesn't always turn out well, and later you get a rusty venture, and things can go downhill pretty quickly. But yeah, they live in more of a bubble than the other children in this novel, and I think part of that is just due to the inherent nature of how those stories work. Everyone has to kind of come out of things, and there can be the tension of in the moment, will they make it through this adventure, or but you always kind of know that they will, and there's never really any serious harm that comes to them. There's never really any high stakes necessarily. No one, you kind of know with those novels, none of the main characters are ever going to die. And so I think that kind of insulates them within this story, because that is how they contextually exist in their own story.
Yeah, my personal read was that like Randolph is probably the oldest at around 16 or 17. Lindsay's around his age or a little younger, and same for Miles. And Chick is right around that same age, maybe a little younger. But I have always thought of Darby as genuinely like 8 or 7 or 8 at the beginning of the book.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, he's the only one who, in the short term we see age and all. And I think he, it's isn't it? I think it's even like said in the first appearance that he's older than he was in a previous book.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely the youngest. I don't know that I could put him at that young, but I don't know.
Well, he's singing the high parts of the songs,
Mhm.
so that puts him prepubescent. That doesn't mean he's necessarily young, but I don't know. I think it is meant to be ambiguous for them, and I think for the other characters, it is much more traceable.
Yeah, I agree with this guy, at least in terms of his statement of at the very beginning of the novel, thinking that they're like 12 or 13. I have trouble kind of putting into words why I assume that they're that young, at least like the first few pages. It might just be like the naked enthusiasm that they show for the World's Fair and everything that makes me think that they haven't reached that age where they're like kind of more withdrawn, or I mean, at this point, yeah, I agree with you all. They're probably 15, 16, 17, 18.
Is that round about the age of like the Hardy Boys and all those other Tom Swift and those other characters, or
Yeah,
were
I
they
think
younger?
I think the Hardy Boys were around that age. I know if they made a movie about it, they'd be the actors would be 30 playing it.
Given their heavily symbolic nature, I wonder if you couldn't pin them down more specifically based on some historical events.
Yeah, that's true.
I have not done that though.
Our next correspondence comes from, oh boy, Mish King FH on Reddit. I'd been waiting for this after hearing about your podcast on Reddit a couple years ago and started listening last night. I've tried reading Against the Day twice before it was defeated each time, largely, as you guys mentioned, by the physical size and weight of the book. Third time is the charm, and I'm over halfway through on the Kindle version, so your timing's perfect for me. I've not finished the episode, but as some constructive feedback, it would help me remember what is going on if you gave a few minutes recap of what happened in the chapters you're discussing before getting into the themes. I imagine anyone who isn't reading at the same time and in the same way as you all a valuable leg up. Looking forward to listening right through into early 2026.
Thanks for reminding us how long this is going to take.
Yeah. And yes, thank you for the feedback on adding some recaps. We'll hopefully be able to continue to do that for the rest of the season.
Another bit of correspondence we got through Reddit was user electronic_county597. For what it's worth, Chums of Chance is not from Finnegan's Wake. The phrase in Finnegan's Wake is "Be British, voice to your belly bone, and chuck a chum a chance." Yeah, I it's one of those things where Finnegan's Wake has so much random noise as the book. Like so much of that book is just nonsense. Like it is true facts. For anyone who doesn't know this, that the word quark for the subatomic particle comes from Finnegan's Wake. But at the same time, like there's also like television appears there, and various other words that can be read as prescient and can also be read as just mishmash of random words, and that's kind of the whole point of the book. So yeah, I don't know if Pynchon would credit the Chums of Chance name as having come from Finnegan's Wake, but having read most of Finnegan's Wake, read is a big word, but
Doing some heavy lifting there. Huh?
I feel very strongly like a lot of Pynchon's philosophy as a literary author and novelist is influenced by that book in particular. So I don't disagree. I mean, obviously, literally, the phrase is "chuck a chum a chance," but I also would not be surprised if that weren't the inspiration, because it sounds like "chum's a chance" or "chum of chance." But Pynchon's not going to tell anyone.
That's true.
Who knows?
And Tuber Prize on Reddit said, "You guys got me through Mason and Dixon. This should be a blast. Thanks for doing it. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed Mason and Dixon a lot, I think, and we're enjoying it against today so far, even if our episodes are each 8 hours long." Yeah, we appreciate you saying thank you and thanks for listening.
You remember when all of us were like blown away by the fact that we covered a book for 4 months?
Yeah. Remember those times? Another one from Reddit, Super Direction 498 says, "Awesome. Been looking forward to this. Thank you for doing these. They made monotonous hours at work quite enjoyable. Glad we can help get you through your workday. I find that I am thinking about what we're going to talk about and what we're going to do while I'm working as well. So, in a sense, the show kind of keeps me getting through my work days as well. So I can sympathize with you there. But thanks so much for listening. We appreciate it."
Yeah, nothing means more to us, I think, than hearing that we might help people not roll off the gun wall.
Yeah. 100%.
It's interesting to think that the four of us talking for 4 hours can help someone get through a monotonous work. But hey, I love it. I'll take it.
This next one comes from Slick Rico.
Great name.
On
Great
Reddit,
name.
Who says, "Awesome timing. I'm just starting a reread and would love the support. Plus, it would keep me up in the reading." Hey, you're welcome. I think that all of us agree that part of the appeal of doing this particular book isn't just the fact that there's very little in terms of like critical resources or conversation about it, but also that it's a very daunting book, and having an additional sort of group of people to do kind of I guess a virtual book club with, or to help provide some support in terms of what things mean, be very helpful.
Yeah, and then our last piece of correspondence that we have here, at least, is via YouTube comments. Satwik Mishra 2312, who said, "This is insane. Thank you so much for this. I can finally get started with Against the Day." And I'll just say, yes, it is insane. We are spending the next 2 years of our lives reading a 1,000-page book, 30 pages
at a time. Hell yeah.
30 pages at a time.
But hey, we're laughing, so glad you feel like we're giving you permission. I want to remind you that you had permit. You were allowed to start Against the Day by yourself.
That's true.
Nobody needs us to help them, but if you want that companionship, we're happy to give it.
Now go do your homework and read the pages for next week's episode, or next 2 weeks' episode, whatever it is.
You're the one who puts these on the RSS feed,
I
dude.
know. It's been a long night.
Dadly Cody cracking the whip once again.
Yeah.
Next episode, speaking of whenever that's going to come out, it is going to comprise of pages 57 to 80 of the Penguin paperback edition. But, as promised, if you are someone who does not have that edition and has the European edition that is a different pagination, the phrase that we're going to be ending on is, "As if Silver were alive, with a soul and a voice, and he'd been working for it as much as it for him." So that is where we'll be ending last. Ending last? Oh god, it has been a long evening.
Everybody's brain.
Why did you you said that, and then I looked at the time and realized that we started talking 5 hours ago, but started recording 4 hours ago. Ending, yeah, I already said it. Anyway, if you think this show's worth $1 after all of that drivel, we would love to have it. So if you like what we're doing and want to support the show, please consider making a donation to our Ko-Fi project. We are on Ko-Fi at ko-fi.com/mappingthezone. Funds we receive will be used to upgrade equipment, pay hosting fees, and help make our show better, just in general.
It's $1 for 4.5 hours of great conversation. That's a bargain.
I'd say that's pretty fair. That is that's less than minimum wage.
Yeah.
Depending on how much we have to cut out.
Yeah.
As always, thanks so much for listening. We do, of course, love to hear from our listeners. So you can find us on Twitter at PinchOnPod. You can find us on Blue Sky, which looks like how Twitter used to look. I don't enjoy the fact that Blue Sky adds this to the end of every account, but mappingthezone.bsky.social.
Yeah, it's not great. Links in the show notes.
It's not great, but yeah, if you go into Blue Sky and search Mapping the Zone, that's us. We're also on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast, and you can also email us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.